Chapter 836. Because Li Nanheng didn't speak, no one here spoke, but their eyes were still fixed on Feng Ling. Put it down and go back first. As if he hadn't heard Xiao Su's suggestion, Li Nanheng coldly put out the cigarette in his hand in the ashtray on the conference table. Li Nanheng's voice was so cold that Xiao Su, who was sitting on the side, felt that he shouldn't have made this suggestion. He immediately shivered and shrank back without saying anything. However, just as Feng Ling nodded and was about to leave, one of the military leaders suddenly said, "I think he is really suitable for this operation. His name is Feng Ling, right? Previously, when we rescued Mayor Ted and his family, he made a great contribution. Furthermore, our people have seen his skills and agility. He is a very reliable member. Furthermore, based on his figure and appearance, if he were to participate in this operation, it would definitely be much easier." Li Nanheng raised his eyes to look at Feng Ling, who was standing in front of the conference room. His eyes were deep and calm, but there seemed to be a huge whirlpool in them, making it difficult for people to read his mind. However, Feng Ling clearly felt that this mission should not be simple, and Boss Li didn't intend to let her participate in it from the beginning. The U.S. military had gradually become particularly dependent on 11 Base over the years. When they encountered some difficult situations, they would directly turn to 11 Base for help. But if they could come to the base in person, it must not be a simple matter. Another comrade in charge of the military also said, "He is indeed very suitable." The other people at the conference table also nodded one after another, including the other drill masters in the base. Indeed, in the entire base, Feng Ling is indeed the most suitable. After hearing these words, Li Nanheng didn't have any expression. He crossed his legs, leaned back, and raised his eyebrows, like a cold emperor, lazy and noble. So, this kind of mission to sneak into the terrorist base is given to a newcomer who has just entered the base for less than 3 years? And he is a member of the team who has just learned how to pick up a sniper rifle? Xiao Su paused and coughed. He felt that Boss Li had always been very proud of Feng Ling's skills, speed, and other aspects. No matter how strict and sarcastic he was to Feng Ling, he would definitely maintain his dignity in public and would never say a word about Feng Ling. But today, Boss obviously didn't intend to let Feng Ling be in the limelight. It seemed that Boss didn't intend to let Feng Ling participate in this mission at all. The person in charge of the military said, "Mr. Li, what we need now is not only flexibility, but also a woman who can absolutely cooperate with us and has the ability to protect herself. But there is no woman in 11 Base, and we can't find a woman who is suitable for this mission. Since this is the base of the terrorists, the most important thing is to dispel their suspicion. We need a person who will never be suspected by them. And Feng Ling absolutely meets the requirements of this mission in terms of body shape and psychological quality. He can definitely disguise as a woman to do this." Hearing this, Li Nanheng's eyes turned cold. Xiao Su immediately said, "In fact, it's not very reliable to pretend to be a woman. I just said it casually. Those terrorists have seen all kinds of women. It's best to find a real woman." As soon as he finished speaking, several drill masters next to him tugged at his sleeves, telling him to shut up quickly and reminding him to look at the faces of the military leaders. Li Nanheng directly closed the computer in front of him, picked up the silver lighter on the side, and played with it casually. From time to time, the crisp sound of the ignition and extinguishment, and the small flame, seemed to reveal a hint of hostility. The man's slender and well-defined fingers were also cold on the silver lighter. "He is not suitable." Li Nanheng tilted his head, and his eyes were very firm. "Change the candidate." No one said a word. Everyone knew that Feng Ling was indeed a very suitable candidate for this operation. But Boss had said it, so no one could say anything more. But the military leader said, "Mr. Li, our operation is to encircle and suppress the terrorists who have threatened the safety of the president for many years. 11 Base is set up here to be ready to sacrifice at any time. Every member of the base knows that there is a possibility of losing his life in a dangerous mission. If Mr. Li cherishes his members and is afraid that they will be in danger, what's the point of setting up this base here?" Li Nanheng threw the lighter in his hand back on the table coldly and asked in a very indifferent voice. The U.S. military and police forces add up to tens of millions of people. They are fully staffed, but the members of 11 Base have to risk their lives again and again. I also want to ask, what's the point of your existence? The military leader's face instantly darkened. He suppressed his anger and said, "This is the order of the higher-ups. In dealing with terrorists, isn't the position of 11 Base in the United Nations as the hardest shield in front? So the people I have carefully cultivated should die in vain?" Li Nanheng's eyes were as cold as a cold pool, cold and piercing. "Let me think about this matter for a while. I will make reasonable arrangements before the mission tomorrow." The military leader smiled coldly and turned to look at Feng Ling. "It's time to make contributions to the United Nations." "Feng Ling, I just want you to disguise as a seemingly weak and harmless woman. Sneak into a bar run by the terrorist leader in the red light district of Los Angeles to spy on the enemy. Cooperate with us to encircle and wipe out their leader, and at the same time overturn their bar and hidden base lair. This kind of thing only requires you to disguise as a woman. It should not be difficult." Feng Ling roughly understood what they were talking about. Now that she heard the words of the military leader, she understood what they were talking about just now. She didn't say anything, but turned to look at Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes, put one hand on the conference table, and looked at Feng Ling with dark eyes. Just as Feng Ling was about to speak, Li Nanheng said coldly, and his words were piercingly cold, "She is just a newcomer, not suitable for this operation. I will arrange another candidate. There is no need to be so anxious to decide on her directly." At the same time he looked at her coldly. "Get out. Dash." Chapter 837. The military leader said with a faint smile, "Mr. Li, you have always cooperated with us in these operations, and you have always been serious and thoughtful. The United Nations and the higher-ups have always been very satisfied with 11 Base. But even if 11 Base is a unique existence that we can't afford to offend, there are still people from the United Nations above us. No matter how influential the Li family is, its lifeline is still in the hands of the United Nations. If you delay this operation because of your selfishness, if the higher-ups are unhappy, they may revoke the power of the base or dismiss you, Mr. Li, which is not worth the loss." Li Nanheng was not threatened by these words at all. He said word by word, and his cold eyes could almost freeze people to death. "No matter who is above us, even if it is the king, since 11 Base is in my hands, the arrangement of the mission members is up to me. The military can only assist in the operation, and has no right to interfere with any decision made in my base." The military people instantly fell silent, but everyone could feel that the temperature in the conference room of the base could not return to normal. No one dared to look at the military leader and Boss Li. They were really like an iceberg in a cold pond. Feng Ling was not afraid of death, but when she heard the words of the military leader, she probably knew the importance of this mission. She was not stupid. She could tell that Boss Li didn't want her to take risks, but she didn't know why he didn't want her to take risks, so she just said, "If you need me, I'm happy to cooperate with you. As a member of 11 Base, I shoulder the mission of the base. Even if it is a mountain of knives or a sea of fire, I can do it." The pen that Xiao Su had been holding in his hand almost broke. He raised his hand to touch his chin and didn't speak, but he suddenly felt a little sad in his heart. Boss Li was not just protecting Feng Ling's life. Everyone knew that Boss Li had a bad temper, but he was still respected and awed by everyone. As long as it was a member of his base, he clearly remembered every life, unlike those people on the military side, who only used 11 Base as a life-saving meat shield and hid behind it. Although they were always at the front, the one standing at the front was always Boss Li himself. Perhaps because of Nanheng's cold eyes, Feng Ling felt a chill in her bones. She said, "Of course, the premise is that Boss Li gives the order. If Boss doesn't give the order, no one in the entire base is qualified to act on their own." Xiao Su faintly raised his eyebrows, thinking, "Feng Ling, you still have some desire to live. Otherwise, if you really go against Boss Li in front of the military leader, I'm afraid you won't be able to see tomorrow's sun." Li Nanheng's expression didn't change at all. His voice was cold, and he only said 3 words, "Get out." After receiving 2 consecutive scram, Feng Ling did not speak anymore and turned to leave. When Feng Ling's figure disappeared from the conference room, the head of the military smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He just said, when 11 Base was established, the older generation really lacked foresight. They should have trained some brave and resourceful women in the base, instead of only accepting men. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had to take the risk of dressing up as a woman, just to find a man of suitable height and appearance. The military leader paused and then said, "Of course, if this mission fails or there is any danger, I'm afraid the elders of the Li family will have to take the blame." At the beginning, they were very firm in opposing the idea of letting women enter the base. In this era, there is no difference between men and women. When a woman is smart and powerful, she is no worse than a man. Besides, this kind of mission that requires a seemingly fragile woman to explore the way can really show what a fatal decision the elders of the Li family and the founder of 11 Base made. The Chinese value men over women is also reflected in the elders of the Li family. Li Nanheng glanced at the person in charge of the military and said, "Since the U.S. military and police value women so much, why can't they even find a qualified woman for this operation? Why do they have to go to 11 Base and disguise themselves as women?" The military leader paused, and his eyes suddenly turned cold. "As far as I know, there are a lot of strong women in the Los Angeles military base. I've seen several women mixed in with the personnel in the previous operations, but they don't seem to be of much use. Since you don't have the stubborn thinking of the older generation, why don't you offer them to us? This is your 11 Base's business. You are responsible for fighting and supporting, and we are only responsible for cooperation. I can't decide the personnel deployment. Since the higher-ups have assigned the mission to you, of course, it's up to you to choose," the military leader said coldly. The king-like man sitting in the middle of the conference table tilted his head, and a cold gleam flashed across his deep black eyes. "Since it's up to us to choose, who gave you the right to assign people here just now? Those cowards who hide behind 11 Base for everything are really brave when it comes to fighting back." You, without waiting for the military director to speak, everyone in the conference room watched the cold and picturesque man pick up the computer on the table with one hand, get up and walk out. What's going on? Mr. Li has always been very polite to the military. Why does he seem to be very unhappy this time? I don't know. Maybe it's because the military leader dares to provoke us every time he comes. He really thinks that our 11 Base is just following orders, and that our boss is easy to deal with. If it weren't for the fact that the elders of the Li family insisted on keeping 11 Base in the United Nations, Boss Li would have already fallen out with them. TSK, these people are really embarrassed. If it weren't for 11 Base, I don't know how many people would have died in so many dangerous missions. Yes, there is an old saying that 2 tigers cannot share a mountain. The U.S. military has long been displeased with 11 Base. After all, most of the power in their hands has been divided up by 11 Base. They gave us so many missions that were obviously fatal, and we did them well without suffering any losses. However, they still asked us for such an operation this time, and even gave us such a difficult task. They are really shameless to the extreme. There was a whisper in the base conference room. Chapter 838. It was late at night, and Feng Ling's sleeping time was fixed. At 10 o'clock, she lay down to rest. All of a sudden her cell phone rang. She took a look at it, and saw that it was a message from Xiao Su. He asked her to go downstairs, and said he had something to talk to her. Feng Ling turned to look out of the window. The light in the room next door hadn't been turned on all night. She picked up a coat, put it on, and went out. When she went downstairs, Xiao Su was waiting for her outside the door, holding a cigarette that was about to burn out. It seemed that he had been waiting downstairs for a while. "Brother Su." Feng Ling walked over. Xiao Su threw the cigarette butt in his hand down, raised his foot to crush it, and said in a low voice, "What do you plan to do about what you heard in the conference room?" "Feng Ling, I don't have any plans. I'll listen to the arrangements of the base. If they want me to go, I'll go." Xiao Su smiled. "You're really straightforward. It's obvious that the military deliberately made things difficult for you, but you're too simple. You don't know the private grievances between the U.S. military and our 11 base. What grievances? When the elders of the Lee family were in charge of our 11 base, we were already very powerful and almost threatened the prestige and status of the U.S. military. In the United Nations, we were also a high-profile force. In recent years, under Boss Lee's leadership, we have become more and more powerful. And for many years, 11 Base has sent a lot of people to the military and the police. You know very well the training methods of our 11 Base. As long as we can get out of the base, we will definitely attract jealousy. So those who are separated from the base have been secretly ostracized by the military and the police. In recent years, 11 Base has sent out a lot of tasks, big and small, to us. Many tasks that the military can't complete have been assigned to us, causing us to become more and more famous. The purpose of the military is to let 11 Base take the lead and weaken our combat power. But 11 Base has let them down again and again. Now these tasks that the head of the military has arranged for us, although they say it's arranged by the United Nations, in fact, it's also related to their secret tricks. They have been looking for opportunities to catch 11 Base's weakness. The situation of the military being divided up by 11 Base makes them uneasy. Now seeing that the base is getting stronger and stronger, they have more and more bad ideas. Feng Ling listened quietly and didn't speak. As we said in the conference room, we really need a girl who is agile but looks weak and won't attract the enemy's attention. But there is no suitable candidate in the base. I suddenly said that because I saw you in women's clothes last time, and thought that if you disguised as a woman, you would be safe. But I ignored boss's thoughts. He doesn't want you to take this risk at all. After all, this time the military is here to let the people of 11 Base die. It will be dangerous for anyone to go. Boss doesn't want you to go. Feng Ling raised her eyebrows. We are all members of the base. We can't refuse the mission. It's the same no matter who goes. Why doesn't boss want me to take this risk? Xiao Su's expression changed and he suddenly whispered, "Are you really stupid or pretending to be stupid?" Feng Ling looked at him in confusion. Xiao Su simply leaned close to her and said in a low voice, "Can't you see Boss Lee's feelings for you? Which member of the base has he been so concerned about? Boss really attaches great importance to you. To put it bluntly, boss just likes you." Feng Ling was dumbfounded. "But I am a man. So what? In today's world, gender is no longer an obstacle. Although boss is very restrained, those of us who often hang around him can see that he definitely has special feelings for you. This time, he won't let you die." After boss left the conference room, he didn't show up again. But I heard that he is reorganizing the elites in the base. This kind of thing that may cost his life. I guess he still plans to do it himself. Speaking of this, Xiao Su sighed. The terrorists we are going to deal with this time are all a group of people who are extremely lustful. In my opinion, it's the safest way to use a woman to seduce them. Boss, because of the responsibility of 11 Base and the reputation of the elders of the Lee family, can't let you take the risk. He would rather sacrifice himself. I really don't feel at ease, so I came to talk to you. When Feng Ling heard Xiao Su said that Boss Lee liked her, her mind was in a mess. When she heard that Boss Lee was going to sacrifice himself, she immediately asked in surprise, "Is Boss going to dress up as a woman?" The corner of Xiao Su's mouth twitched. "Do you think such a tall man can't see that he is a man in women's clothes? Do you think everyone is like you? It's really difficult to distinguish a man from a woman when he wears women's clothes." Feng Ling. She paused and then said, "Since 11 Base doesn't have to completely obey the arrangement of the military, can't we communicate with the higher-ups about this kind of mission? Do we have to take the risk? What does the military do? Is it just a decoration watching coldly from the sidelines?" Xiao Su sighed. How can boss be suppressed by the military? But the base has its mission. 11 Base is the hard work of the elders of the Lee family for decades, and the lifeblood of the Lee family. He will not easily compromise. But he can't let the reputation of 11 Base be ruined by those people. He must do what he should do, even if it may cost his life. But which mission is easy and safe? There is no most dangerous mission, only more dangerous. With that, Xiao Su shook his head again. In fact, I said so much just to tell you that boss is actually considerate of everyone except himself. In this situation, Fengling, although boss doesn't allow you to participate in the mission, I think you can really play a vital role this time. Whether boss and the elites in our base can come back safely or not depends on you. Fengling nodded and said, Fengling, I don't want you to participate in the mission. Seeing that Fengling didn't speak anymore, Xiao Su suddenly turned around, walked into the door, and took out a bag at the bottom of the stairs. I was afraid it would be too abrupt, so I didn't hold it in my hand. Since I've said so much, I'll give it to you. It's up to you whether to go or not. I'll text you the location of the mission gathering place later. Chapter 839. Fengling didn't know what was in the bag. Why did Xiao Su ask her out so mysteriously, and specially give it to her? He weighed the bag in his hand, and opened it to take a look inside. After seeing what was inside, he immediately closed the bag with a slightly hot face. He then looked at the back of Xiao Su, who had already walked far away, and turned around to go upstairs with the bag. Back in the room, she looked at the bag in her hand again, and poured all the things inside on the bed. It was a white dress with a fashionable and beautiful design, and it was a suspender skirt. There was a circle of white translucent lace that looked particularly cute at the bottom of the skirt. More importantly, there was a set of nude women's underwear. The cup of the underwear was at least C cup. It didn't look too big on her body, but it also wasn't small enough to make people suspicious. And a pair of incredibly soft silicone flesh-colored things. To put it simply, he was afraid that she wouldn't look like a woman after putting on clothes, or that she would put too exaggerated water balloons in like last time. So he bought her a pair of silicone fake breasts. Where on earth did Xiao Su go to buy these things? This pair of fake breasts felt so soft and elastic as if they were real. Okay. Fengling picked up the pair of fake breasts and looked at it. She pinched it twice in her hand, and it felt so good that she almost blushed. There was a box in the bag that didn't fall out. She took out the box and opened it. She saw a pair of high heels and flesh-colored stockings that looked extremely sexy, including a waist-length, slightly curly, wavy black wig. The hair looked soft and natural, not fake at all. There seemed to be something at the bottom of the box. Fengling touched it with her hand and took out a lipstick, a small box of 3-color eyeshadow, and mascara from a thin layer of paper below. Looking at all the things spread on the bed, Fengling, Xiao Su was really a talent to be able to buy so many things. The next day, the tall black Hummer galloped in the area, where several helicopters were parked and stopped in the middle. Li Nanheng got out of the car and began to arrange their actions one by one. He picked up the walkie-talkie and explained other matters to the people in the helicopter, who could not come out for the time being. Just when they were about to set off after checking the number of people, a black off-road vehicle that the members of 11 Base could drive away in an emergency suddenly came from another direction and stopped steadily 1 meter away from the man in a black uniform and black military boots. Li Nanheng looked at the car that suddenly stopped beside him. There was a protective layer on the window, so he couldn't see the person inside. He just stared at the car and didn't speak immediately. He slowly put down the walkie-talkie in his hand and looked expressionlessly at the car door that was opened at this time. At the moment when Fengling stepped out of the car, the elites of the base around all widened their eyes in disbelief, only to see a pair of slender legs wearing slender and sexy little high heels appear in their sight. Then they slowly looked up and saw a slender and graceful girl with waist-length hair, wearing a white dress that looked pure and sexy, standing directly by the car door. This girl's figure was strange to everyone, but the face with light makeup and even a thin layer of lipstick shocked everyone. It was Fengling. Fengling was dressed as a girl, and when she got out of the car and closed the door, she was charming and handsome, and then she threw the car key into Li Nanheng's arms. At the moment when the man instinctively caught the electronic car key, she smiled at him. "Boss, if I don't come, won't it be a waste of the combat power of the elites of the base?" After about 5 seconds, Li Nanheng finally spat out a few words. "Who asked you to come here?" Fengling smiled. "Yesterday, I heard it clearly in the conference room. The best strategy for this operation is to find someone to dress up as a woman and sneak into the bars run by terrorists at night to wait for an opportunity to act. Although it is really difficult for a man to dress up as a woman, as a member of the base, I can't absolve myself from the blame. Boss, please don't ask me to go back with the reason that I am a newcomer. I am a member of the base, and I will die as the soul of the base. It's not my style to be a coward. Anyway, it's not the first time that I've dressed up. But this time I just put on a pair of silicone fake breasts. It's okay. After speaking, Feng Ling deliberately straightened her waist and raised her hand to make a gesture in front of her chest. She didn't need the pair of fake breasts that Xiao Su bought for her at all. She just needed to untie the chest wrapping cloth, and the C-cup underwear would be just right for her. But in order not to arouse suspicion, she raised her hand and simply rubbed and pinched her chest. To be honest, now this thing made of silicone is more real than the real one. Wasn't it more real than the real one? A group of elites of the base standing nearby watched Feng Ling rubbing her chest, and their mouths went dry. This was too real. And this body proportion. Was Feng Ling really a man? Li Nanheng also heard what she said and looked at her movements. Even if you are willing to sacrifice your face for the base, and are willing to dress up as a woman, I don't seem to have assigned you a task. Who gave you the courage to disobey the orders of your superior and act on your own initiative during a mission? At this moment, the man's tone was completely that of a superior, and there was not the slightest bit of warmth. Feng Ling approached him until she stood in front of the man. The faint fragrance of the girl, or the boy's body, spread into the man's nose again. He quietly glanced at her clothes that didn't seem out of place. At such a close distance, he couldn't see which part of her body looked fake. Instead, only a thin black hair clip in her hair betrayed her. He could tell that this long hair was fake, but the rest was really terrifying. Boss Lee, you also know that when I was hospitalized, I had already familiarized myself with all the rules and regulations of the base. I know the price of acting on my own initiative, but now the mission is ahead. After all of us safely return, boss can punish me. I will definitely bear all the consequences, and will definitely not find any excuse for myself. Feng Ling stood in front of the man and curved her pink and tender lips. She stood very, very close to him, and her voice was clear and clean. It seemed that because of this dress, even her voice sounded almost like a girl's, making one's body go soft. Because of her approach, Li Nanheng quietly watched her face. His gaze inadvertently swept over her chest, and slowly narrowed his eyes. Chapter 840. Because of her approach, Li Nanheng looked at her face calmly, glanced at her chest inadvertently, and slowly narrowed his eyes. Fake. Feng Ling was wearing a white suspenders skirt. When she put on this skirt after changing into her underwear, she found that the cleavage on her chest was too obvious. At a glance, she knew it was not fake, so she added a tight-fitting suspenders inside to cover it a little. However, looking from top to bottom, it still looked very real. It didn't look like a pair of silicone gels had been added to a flat chest at all. She smiled. Boss, do you want to poke it with your hand to see if it really feels so real? Li Nanheng glanced at her face and looked at her eyes that were not timid but shining. He looked away expressionlessly and didn't touch it. He just threw the electronic car key back into her arms. Go back to the base. The man was tall and his tone was heavy, because the girl in front of him looked very thin and petite. Such a visual contrast made him even more imposing. Feng Ling placed the key in her hand and played with it casually. Her voice was so low that only he could hear her. I've already made such a big sacrifice. Boss, do you want to treat me like a piece of trash and drive me back to the base in public? Everyone knows that if I participate in this matter, the problem will be much simpler. It's better to use wits than force. Who says that I will really die if I sneak into a bar dressed like this? Li Nanheng didn't move but just stood there, looking at the girl in front of him. The group of people waited by the side. They felt that there seemed to be something in Boss's eyes when he looked at the girl Feng Ling, but it seemed that he had been restraining something. When they wanted to take a closer look, they found that Boss Li's expression was only cold and didn't look like what they thought. You're not going back. Li Nanheng looked at her firm face and asked coldly, Do you know what kind of experience you will face if you sneak into that kind of bar dressed like this? Feng Ling paused and her eyes flickered. Anyway, I am a man. What kind of experience can I face? I'll just adapt to the situation. Hearing this, Li Nanhing's cold eyes suddenly lit up with a terrible flame. If you don't have full confidence, you don't have to go. If you go, you will drag everyone down. You'd better not go. I won't drag anyone down. Once I find the situation is not good, I will find a way to protect myself as soon as possible. Of course, if I can't protect myself. Feng Ling stared into his eyes. I know the rules of 11 base. I would rather die than be humiliated. Even if I die with them, I won't be suppressed by them and become your burden. Boss, you can rest assured. Seeing that she was too determined, Li Nanheng looked at her face with light makeup and her lips that looked even more pink because of the thin lipstick. He reached out to pinch her chin, carefully looked at her face and slowly said, almost biting his words, "You look like this now. Fortunately, you are a man in your bones. Otherwise, I would definitely let you have a taste." Before he finished speaking, he paused when he saw Feng Ling's exposed white shoulders in the suspenders dress. Feng Ling didn't understand what he meant. Taste what? Taste what? Of course. Let Feng Ling taste the consequences of disobeying orders? If it was a man, he would punish him until he cried on the training ground. If it was a woman, he would punish her until she cried on the bed. Li Nanheng looked away expressionlessly and said coldly, "Today's mission can only be successful. You don't have to die with them. Everyone must return to the base safely." Seeing that he allowed her to go with him, Feng Ling immediately smiled, raised her hand, and gave a standard salute of 11 base. Got it. Looking at the girl in front of him, who seemed to be delicate and charming, with a bit of a heroic spirit that other women didn't have, and looking at the flower-like smile on the girl's face, Li Nanheng suddenly noticed the wolf-like eyes around him. He turned to see that the elites of the base were staring at Feng Ling's figure and bare shoulders, and he glanced at her coldly. "Is your uniform in the car? Take it off and put it on." It was a cold and commanding tone. "I didn't bring my uniform. Didn't I dress up as a woman? In order to make it more realistic and not arouse the enemy's suspicion, I don't even have a gun on me. How could I bring my uniform out?" Li Nanheng's gaze gradually turned cold. He abruptly took off his black uniform jacket and forcibly put it on her back. Then, as though he was only helping her put on the jacket, he pulled her into his arms. Feng Ling was not used to wearing high heels. She staggered forward and leaned into his arms uncontrollably. The tip of her nose bumped into his strong chest through the black t-shirt. The faint cool scent of the man's body, mixed with the unique minty scent of tobacco, instantly lingered in her nose. Feng Ling stiffened and didn't move, feeling the strength of the man when he helped her put on the jacket and his breath on her head. Her ears kept echoing with Xiao Su's words. "Can't you see Boss Li's feelings for you? Has he ever cared so much about any member of the base? Boss really values you. To put it bluntly, Boss just likes you. Boss likes you." Feng Ling couldn't help glancing up. At this moment, Li Nanheng helped her zip up the incredibly large uniform, pushed her forward and said coldly, "Get in the car." The car Feng Ling drove was not suitable for the mission site, so she could only follow their car or helicopter. She quickly came back to herself, nodded, and turned to get into the black Hummer next to her, Li Nanheng. The elites of the base who were still standing around gossiping immediately withdrew their gossipy expressions when they saw Li Nanheng's gaze. They all got ready and quickly boarded the helicopter, ready to set off. In the car. "Boss, isn't it too obvious to dress like this?" Feng Ling sat in the passenger seat. Probably because she was wearing a skirt, she couldn't sit as casually as usual. She sat there with her legs together, looking more like a little girl. Li Nanheng glanced at her lightly. "Take it off after we arrive at the mission site." "Who bought you a skirt? Why are you so exposed? Do you need to show so much when you're dressed as a woman?" "Feng Ling. Maybe it's to look more real." Chapter 841. Real. It was really King real. If it weren't for the fact that he had something to do, when he saw Feng Ling dressed like this in such an unguarded situation, he would definitely get hard again in front of her. Feng Ling didn't look at Li Nanheng, who was driving. She usually wore such a black uniform, but she had never worn anyone else's uniform. She really didn't expect that Boss Li's uniform would be so big on her now. She felt that this uniform was so big that it could directly cover her buttocks, and the cuffs had to be rolled up several times to show her hands. She was like a child who stole adults' clothes. She rolled up her sleeves as she said, "When we arrive at the destination, I'd like to ask Boss to give me a few pointers about tonight's mission. I suddenly cut in the middle of the queue, so I don't know the specifics. You have to tell me exactly what to do when the time comes." As she spoke, Feng Ling had already rolled up her sleeves, but the cuffs were also very wide. When she spoke, she raised her hands, and the wide cuffs swayed. Her fair and tender arms directly shook the man's eyes. "What?" The man directly looked away, no longer looking at her, and drove expressionlessly. Feng Ling's task sounded very simple, but in fact, once it was exposed, she would instantly die in the bar. She needed to pretend to be a barmaid in the bar, accompany the leaders of the terrorists to drink in the private room at night, inquire about their plans, and at the same time be prepared to cooperate with them from both inside and outside, waiting for the opportunity to directly kill their leader or directly capture him. For the sake of her safety, Li Nanheng didn't let her capture the terrorist leader alone inside, but only asked her to be prepared to protect herself and cooperate with them from both inside and outside. However, Feng Ling was more or less aware of the nature of this mission. If she could get the best opportunity, it would be better to capture the leader of this terrorist group alive. In this way, she could get more information from him, which would be of great help to either side. Before sneaking into the bar, the base had arranged in advance the only spy in the bar, because this kind of place seemed to be open to the public, but in fact, some of the private rooms inside were not accessible to any hostess, and not everyone could casually sit next to those people and listen to them. Without the cooperation and arrangement of the spy inside, she couldn't get in at all. The spy arranged by 11 base inside was a very fair-looking bartender about 20 years old. He looked very simple, but he was so agile that even Feng Ling was a little surprised, and he reacted very quickly to any situation. In less than half an hour, he successfully brought Feng Ling into the bar, avoided everyone's sight, and didn't arouse anyone's suspicion. Feng Ling didn't need to change her clothes. She only needed to put on a thicker lipstick. When the bartender saw her overly plain appearance, he said that although she looked like a woman, none of the hostesses here would be so plain. Thus, he found a small gold necklace and some good-looking bracelets for her to wear. Feng Ling didn't know where to put them on, but she didn't know why. After Feng Ling put on the bracelets, the bartender directly made an okay gesture to her. Obviously, her current dress looked quite foolproof. Before entering the private room, Feng Ling had already known that the primary targets of today's task were the two most important leaders of this group of terrorists. One of them had a very easy-to-remember and common name, named David, who was a black African, and the other was named Paul, who was Russian. David was the real boss, but Paul was a very sharp person. He was equivalent to the most powerful strategist around the boss, and he was the one that needed to be guarded against and treated with caution the most. The rest of the terrorists present came from all over the world, but most of them communicated with each other in English, but there might be some secret codes that others couldn't understand. Feng Ling needed to distinguish the meaning of those secret codes by herself, so that she could cooperate with the people of 11 base outside. After getting all the information, it happened to be the time when the group of people arrived at the bar to talk in the evening. At 8:30 p.m., many people came into the bar one after another. Feng Ling sat at the bar counter, holding a goblet in her hand. It seemed to be wine, but in fact, it was a fruit wine with a very low alcohol content, made by the bartender according to her drinking capacity. However, from a distance, it looked like a very strong whiskey and smelled the same. The lights in the bar shone on everyone randomly. Feng Ling sat in front of the bar casually and seductively, talking and laughing with the people standing inside from time to time. The bartender often appeared beside her at the right time, reminding her who had just come, and whether all the people had arrived or not. David was violent and bloody, but he was particularly fond of women. Every time he came to the bar to talk about business, he would specially invite the hostesses arranged by the bar to drink with him. This time was no exception. The manager of the bar had investigated the situation of every hostess here, so he was very reassured. However, the bartender took advantage of the fact that the manager didn't notice and put Feng Ling into the team of those women. Anyway, these women were usually separated and were not allowed to contact in private, so they were not particularly familiar with each other. Feng Ling walked into the private room, and the first thing she saw was that there were more than a dozen people sitting inside, including black, yellow, and white skin. The man sitting in the middle was dark all over and holding a cigar in his mouth. He was the leader of the terrorists, David. She had seen his photo in Boss Lee's car just now and recognized the more important people among them, such as David, Paul, and 2 or 3 other people who could be considered leaders. It was they who bombed a plane in New York half a month ago, attacked a TV station in the United States, broke into the live broadcast room during the live broadcast, and shot the news anchor in front of tens of millions of TV viewers. Then they sat there and announced that they would infiltrate every corner of the United States, and their ultimate goal was the residence of the president. This group of people was very arrogant. But it was undeniable that every group of terrorists derived from the United States, no matter large or small, was very bold, and they were all desperados who didn't care about life and death at all. Chapter 842. When she saw a good empty seat, she walked over. "Are you new here? Don't you know the rules?" Paul saw a young girl in a white dress walking towards a less crowded area after entering the door. He immediately looked in her direction suspiciously. Feng Ling turned to look at him, lowered her head, and stood there with an uneasy expression. "Come sit here." Paul patted a very narrow empty seat next to him. Feng Ling walked over without hesitation. When she walked up to him and was about to sit next to him, her wrists suddenly tightened. The yellow-haired man sitting on the sofa looked frighteningly thin but shrewd and decisive. Directly pulled her onto his lap. As soon as Paul sat on his lap, the expression on her face didn't change. When he was about to lift her chin to take a closer look, she quickly reached out to pick up the wine glass on the coffee table, poured a glass of wine, and fed it to his mouth, saying coquettishly, "Sir, drink." The warm and fragrant jade in his arms, and this coquettish voice instantly made Paul's bones soften. Earlier, he was a little suspicious, but when she sat down, the natural fragrance emitted by the girl's body and her attractive figure made Paul not do anything particularly sharp. He just drank the wine in her hand and then held her white and tender little hand to rub it. Feng Ling maintained a smile on her face. However, when Paul touched the 2 thin calluses on her palm, which were slightly worn out because of years of training to hold a gun, he immediately glanced at her eyes, pinched her hand, and said with a smile, "Such a beautiful and delicate beauty. Why do such things grow in your hands?" Feng Ling didn't panic at all. "Sir, because my family is poor. I have been helping my parents with housework and going out to do business since I was a child. My hands have touched too many things, so they have thin calluses. If my family is rich, why would I run out to be a bartender? Sir, you won't despise me because of my hands, will you? If my family is rich, who will come out to drink every night? Really?" Paul looked at her smiling eyes and stroked her soft and slender waist through her white dress. When he almost touched her chest, the smile on Feng Ling's face did not diminish at all. Before his hand touched her, she turned to pour a glass of wine, dodged his hand and fed it to his mouth. After feeding him a few glasses, Paul was not drunk at all. Instead, he asked Feng Ling to drink as well. He even asked the waiter to bring in several kinds of stronger alcohol. Every time he opened a bottle, he poured a glass for Feng Ling to taste. Feng Ling rarely drank, so her alcohol tolerance was naturally low. 1 or 2 glasses of this kind of wine were enough to knock her out. After she reluctantly drank a few glasses, her face was already red. But since she was a bartender, she would definitely be suspected if her alcohol tolerance was too low. She took the opportunity to walk away from Paul's lap and sit next to him. While they were sitting in the private room talking, she tried to shake off the feeling of drunkenness and remembered all the contents of their conversation in her heart. About 40 minutes later, Feng Ling's brain could hardly maintain such a sober state. When David and Paul talked about an important topic, Paul suddenly thought of her. He poured a glass of wine and handed it to her. "Come on, have another glass." Feng Ling looked at the glass of wine with her sober eyes, hesitated when she put it to her mouth, and only took a sip before putting down the glass. "I want to go to the bathroom first," she said. Paul didn't stop her and looked at her. "Okay. I also want to go to the men's bathroom and the women's bathroom. After all, it's on the way. Shall I accompany you?" Feng Ling nodded shyly, got up and walked out. Walking side by side with Paul in the dimly lit corridor of the bar, Song Yinxuan's pace seemed steady, but she was still a little unsteady. When they finally arrived at the door of the washroom, Song Yunxian hurriedly entered the ladies' washroom before Paul turned around to tell her anything. After finding a small cubicle, she quickly took out the hangover medicine that the bartender had prepared for her from the small leather bag that she had prepared temporarily. Without any water, she directly stuffed it into her mouth and swallowed it. Then, after standing in the room for 2 minutes, Feng Ling closed the small leather bag in her hand, turned around, and was about to open the door to go out, but her hand holding the door handle paused at this moment. Although she couldn't hear clearly, she vaguely felt that the atmosphere in the women's bathroom was a bit subtle. The effect of the antidote was not so fast, but at this moment, her heart was much calmer. She heard that Paul was a very smart person, but his martial arts skills were very ordinary. After calming down for a few seconds, she suddenly pushed the door open. Sure enough, as soon as she opened the door, she saw a black muzzle pointing at her head. She looked at Paul in panic and confusion at first, who was holding a gun in front of her. Although she tried to explain, Paul didn't intend to let her go. At the moment he pulled the trigger, Feng Ling, who lowered her head in fear, suddenly had a flash in her eyes. She kicked him hard on his knee at an unexpected speed, and with the advantage of her high-heeled shoes, she raised her foot and kicked him in the face when he fell to the ground. After kicking him into the cubicle of the bathroom, she grabbed his arm, bent it back hard, and knocked his head hard. Before he had time to struggle, she snatched the gun. She guessed that this gun couldn't be a silencer gun, so she couldn't shoot it here. She knocked Paul out with a chop, hid the gun in her skirt, and turned to walk out of the bathroom quickly. Tonight's action couldn't be delayed. Since Paul had already suspected her, it meant that others might have also suspected her. At the moment when Feng Ling rushed out of the bathroom, she seemed to hear a large number of people approaching in the distance. She paused, turned her eyes abruptly, and saw a man coming from another direction. Bosley? Wasn't he supposed to be waiting for backup outside? Why did he suddenly break in alone? Li Nanheng walked closer from the other side of the corridor. He had changed his clothes, and his shirt was half open. His black hair was like the arrogant ink-colored night, and his coldness made her heart instantly safe. However, as the footsteps of a large number of people approached, Feng Ling looked around and saw the place where Paul had fainted behind her. She was annoyed that there was no more suitable place to hide and avoid suspicion, but the man who had approached had already come up to her. Before she could react, he stretched out his long arm and took her into his arms. Feng Ling felt her waist tighten, and the next moment, she was quickly pressed against the wall next to the bathroom by the man, completely blocking her figure. She didn't understand what Bosley was going to do. She opened her mouth to ask in a low voice, but the man in front of her suddenly bowed his head. She didn't know if it was because the antidote hadn't worked yet, but the man's strong aura made her a little dizzy. Then Li Nanheng lowered his head and suddenly kissed her. Chapter 843. The man suddenly lowered his head. Feng Ling's eyes suddenly widened, and her lips felt numb. The unhesitant, almost domineering kiss made Feng Ling stiffen, and she pressed her hands against the cold wall behind her. However, the man in front of her took advantage of the moment when she was absent-minded, opened her teeth, and fiercely kissed her. She was stimulated by the intense kiss and trembled. She subconsciously raised her hand to push him away, but the man hugged her even tighter and pressed her against the wall even more fiercely. There was no gap between their bodies, and in an instant, all her breath was taken away. After about 10 seconds, the footsteps of those people were getting closer and closer. Feng Ling raised her eyes to look at the man who was close to her, and whose breath was entwined with hers. The expression on Li Nanheng's face did not change. Feng Ling was still sober, but because of his sudden kiss she panicked. Without giving her any time to think, he held half of her face with his strong palms, bent down, and continued to kiss her more deeply. Those footsteps were getting closer and closer. At this time, Li Nanheng warned her with his eyes to cooperate and not to move. Feng Ling didn't expect that he would come to support her alone in this way. Of course she didn't move. After all, she was still sober. But her whole body seemed to be almost out of her control at this moment, as her lips were tightly pressed against the man's warm and soft lips. And when they went deeper, they almost touched each other. She felt as if a basin of hot water had been poured over her head, from the top of her head to her limbs to the tip of her toes. There was no place that was not boiling, and her hands, which were pressed against the wall, seemed to be numb and unable to move at all. David and the others are still in the private room? The footsteps had come behind Li Nanheng. Several terrorists who had just rushed back from outside glanced fiercely at the people who were dancing crazily on the dance floor of the bar behind them. They were about to walk to the private room when they suddenly saw a man and a woman kissing at the door of the bathroom in front of the corridor. From this angle, they could only see that the woman who was pressed against the wall was very slender, as if she was completely pressed there and kissed by the man. And the man in the half-open black shirt was tall and straight, making people couldn't help but look at him. He should still be there. The time we agreed on was 8:30. He's almost an hour late now. He's probably still waiting for us to plan our deployment for this week. Another person whispered in the crowd. The bar's business has been particularly good recently. There are too many people coming and going. We still have to be careful and not let anyone see through us. They are all trash who run to the bar to drink and pick up girls. At most, they are all kinds of hooligans. Why do we need to guard against them? The man in the lead said as he walked quickly behind the people who were kissing by the wall. The dozen people behind him couldn't help but glance at the man and woman by the wall. At the moment when the eyes of the group of people fell in their direction, Li Nanheng's hand directly peeled off the shoulder strap on Feng Ling's shoulder. But he still pressed her against the wall very tightly. Although the important part of the girl's half-naked shoulder could not be seen, people could instantly see the charming fragrance between the two people by the wall, as if the two people were really trapped in kissing and passion, making people unable to see any stiffness or flaws. When almost everyone passing by behind looked carefully at Li Nanheng's back, Feng Ling finally understood. She raised her stiff hand that was pressed against the wall, reached forward, and hugged the man's waist tightly. At the same time, as if she couldn't help but pull the corner of his shirt under his belt, her hand also reached inside the man's shirt, randomly groping the man's perfect and strong abdomen and back. Young people nowadays are really open in the bar. Are they going to *CK people outside the bathroom? Ha ha ha, if it weren't for the fact that we're in a hurry, I think we could stand here for a few more minutes to watch the live broadcast. The group of people behind laughed and passed by. They didn't see any guns, knives, or suspicious objects on the two of them. Instead, it made their blood boil. They directly withdrew their gaze from them, and did not pay attention to the open door of the women's bathroom. They chatted and laughed as they passed by. Although there were some thin calluses on Feng Ling's palm, due to holding a gun for a long time, the girl's exceptionally soft, white, and tender little hand was still different from that of a man. The deliberate touch on the man's body was different from the usual fighting during training. It was incredibly soft. The purpose was to help her divert the attention of those terrorists. After all, there was no other safer hiding place here. But the touch on her waist made Li Nanheng's kiss, which was originally just for others to see, deepen uncontrollably. The soft and slender body in his arms could only obediently cooperate, because she didn't know what he was going to do next. He took the opportunity to firmly open her teeth, hooked Feng Ling's tongue, and kissed her fiercely. Even his spurting breath became more and more uncontrollable with this kiss. His breathing became heavier and heavier, and his hand almost broke Feng Ling's waist in an instant. He held her tightly in his arms, and leaned down to kiss her fiercely. Although she had heard the footsteps of the group of people walking away, Feng Ling immediately moved her hand away from Li Nanheng's waist and pressed it back against the wall. She didn't dare to move at first, but the man still didn't let her go after so long. She looked at him in confusion with her somewhat blurred and half-sober eyes. She wanted to speak, but her lips were covered by the man's. The kiss gradually deepened, and she felt pain and numbness on her lips. Feng Ling opened her mouth to speak, but the man took the opportunity to enter her mouth, as if to swallow everything in her mouth. After confirming that those people had turned into the private room on the other side of the corridor, the other group of people inside would definitely be suspicious if they didn't see Paul return after such a long time. Feng Ling hurriedly raised her hand to push Li Nanheng away, but the man pressed her deeper against the wall, held her waist tighter, and kissed her lips harder. The feeling of being swallowed alive by a man almost instantly made Feng Ling shiver all over. She subconsciously wanted to push him away, but the man directly sucked on her lips, as if punishing her. In an instant, she felt that her lips were about to swell. Chapter 844. Feng Ling shuddered and tried to struggle, but the man's hand was not too presumptuous. The moment he touched her chest, he felt that the pair of silicone gels she had stuffed inside were too real. And it felt too. Before the man could savor it carefully, Feng Ling bit his lips hard. He paused and looked deeply at the girl imprisoned in front of him. For a moment, he thought how good it would be if he was really a woman instead of pretending to be a woman. In that case, no matter whether she was 18 years old or not, no matter whether she was an adult or not, he would engrave his mark on her and make her his woman. However, this unrealistic idea had just sprouted in his mind when Feng Ling abruptly raised her hand and poked an acupoint on the side of his waist with her finger. Feng Ling was different from the other men in the base. She also had various tactics when it came to close combat. Other men had the least patience to learn the acupoints of the human body to find the enemy's weakness, but only Feng Ling had learned this unpopular course in the base comprehensively. Right now, the place where her finger was poking was a numbing acupoint on the side of his waist. As long as she exerted a little more force, half of his body would instantly feel a tingling pain. If she exerted any more force, half of his body would be numb for several days, and he wouldn't even be able to hold the gun steadily. When the man kissed her and looked at her, Feng Ling also looked at him with warning eyes. The man closed his eyes and lingered on her lips for a few seconds before finally letting her go. The moment the man took a step back, Feng Ling quickly raised her hand and wiped her almost red and swollen lips harshly. Without saying anything, she didn't look at him anymore, turned around, and quickly walked back into the women's room. The mission was more important. Li Nanheng glanced at his lower body, stood where he was with a cold expression, and slowly exhaled in a way that Feng Ling couldn't hear clearly. His little brother, who had been moving frequently recently, seemed to be particularly disobedient, especially when Feng Ling was dressed in women's clothes. He composed himself and walked in. There was no one else in the women's room at this moment. Feng Ling walked in, opened a partition door inside, and gestured for him to see the person inside. Li Nanheng glanced at Paul, who had fallen unconscious by the toilet. Without guessing, he knew it was Feng Ling's masterpiece. You defeated their think tank in such a short period of time. Not bad. Feng Ling glanced at the man lying inside and said mildly, "He's too smart for his own good. He's been suspecting me and thinking that he can kill me by following me out. Maybe it's because I look like a weak woman who doesn't have any skills that he dares to fight against me alone." At this point, Feng Ling continued, "His skills are indeed terrible. Previously, when I found out that his skills were average, I thought he could at least fight a few times. I didn't expect him to be so terrible. No matter what, he's the brains of these terrorists. No matter what, he's also a schemer who plans to attack various places in New York. He really disappoints me." Li Nanheng sneered. "Do you think all the think tanks in the world are as difficult to deal with as Mo Jingshan?" Feng Ling didn't have a particularly deep impression of Mr. Mo. And for many years, she had only heard of his name in the base. She only knew that he often contacted Boss Li in 11 base, and that Mr. Mo had secretly helped a lot in many decisions and plans in the base. She heard from Kay that this Mr. Mo was between the underworld and the underworld. But his hands were clean, and he was Boss Lee's close friend. The Mo family had a powerful background. Although this Mr. Mo was young, he had a lot of influence in the American business world and the underworld. Even in the American underground arms trade, many mafias offered hundreds of millions of yuan just to buy his head. Although she hadn't seen him before, after hearing this name for so many years in the base, she was instinctively full of awe for this person. Kay and the others described Mr. Mo as the think tank and the big boss behind the scenes of 11 Base. Thus, Feng Ling instinctively feared the word think tank. She didn't expect that this Paul, who was called the think tank of the terrorists, was so weak. It was really an insult to this word. The terrorists we are dealing with now are not integrated with the largest terrorist group at present. They are just a small part of the side branch. They are brave but not astute. To put it simply, the real manipulator behind the terrorist group looks down on them and kicked them out. They work alone to make a living. Compared with those terrorist groups that can't be wiped out no matter how hard they try, this group of people is not so dangerous. As long as we deal with them properly, it's easy to catch them all. As Li Nanheng spoke, Feng Ling touched the gun hidden in her skirt and said in a low voice, "I just took his gun. I should sneak into the private room to continue snooping. Should I bring this gun with me or? Did they search you before you went in? Yes. Then take it with you. When they think of searching you again, our people have successfully come in. There won't be a problem. Keep it to protect yourself." Okay. After closing the door in the bathroom, Feng Ling tidied up her skirt and pulled up the straps that had just been pulled down by Li Nanheng. She didn't look at the man next to her. The two seemed to have a tacit understanding not to mention the kiss just now, as if nothing had happened. Before walking out of the bathroom, Feng Ling asked, "Boss, didn't we agree that you and the brothers in the base will wait for my signal outside and then come in to support us? If you take the risk to come in like this, it will be very dangerous if you are discovered. After all, I am disguised as a woman, so the chance of being discovered is smaller. But you take the risk." Feng Ling actually wanted to ask him if he had suddenly come in, because he was worried about her being alone inside. But the next words were swallowed by her throat, and she didn't continue to ask. Li Nanheng knew what she wanted to ask and didn't answer her. When he walked to the door, he stepped aside to let her go out smoothly. At the moment when Feng Ling passed by, he glanced at her ear and said casually, "Your ear is red again." "Feng Ling." She walked away expressionlessly toward the direction of the private room. After Feng Ling left, Li Nanheng silently looked at the dark direction at the end of the corridor in the distance, picked up his cell phone, and called the bartender hiding in the bar. "I'm in the bathroom. Send the clothes I prepared in advance over immediately." "Yes." Chapter 845. Li Nanheng took the clothes from his hands and reached for the exquisite buttons on his black shirt. He unbuttoned them one by one and changed into the clothes that the bartender had brought over. Then he said unhurriedly, "In 10 minutes, arrange for a circuit failure. I will enter the private room in 15 minutes. Yes." Earlier, when Li Nanheng pressed Feng Ling against the wall, he pressed her down hard. The passers-by could only vaguely see a woman in a white dress, but there were so many people in white clothes in the bar that they couldn't tell which one it was. Thus, when Feng Ling walked into the private room again, the people who saw her knew that she was a hostess who went out with Paul. When they didn't see their companion return, they asked coldly in a hoarse voice, "Why did you come back alone?" Feng Ling answered softly, "That gentleman said his stomach was not feeling well and asked me to come back after I came out of the bathroom. He should be in the men's bathroom." After speaking, she obediently sat back in her original seat. The people who entered the private room later only looked at her suspiciously for a moment before continuing to talk about their topics and plans. Indeed, as Bosley said, although they mostly communicated in English, some important clues, locations, and time arrangements had special codes and pronouns that she didn't understand. However, she vaguely heard about the White House and other topics, so she knew that although they had secret codes, The things they were discussing this time were mainly related to the White House and the attack on the president. After listening for nearly 10 minutes, she finally connected their secret codes and all the clues together. They planned to fly a helicopter to the area above the White House on Friday afternoon and launch a bomb attack. Their people had already infiltrated the White House. Originally, the area near the White House could not be easily flown by any aircraft, but they had already taken control of the person in charge of that area and replaced it with their own people. Hearing this news, Feng Ling obediently sat by the side and drank. From time to time, she would smile and hand a drink to the man next to her, trying her best to maintain her identity as a hostess. However, Paul still didn't return. From the time he left with Feng Ling to the 10 minutes now, he had been gone for nearly half an hour. The chatter in the private room gradually died down. Their leader, David, had already glanced at Feng Ling, who had been chatting and laughing with the others. The others also looked at Feng Ling at the same time. There was no change in the atmosphere, but Feng Ling could vaguely feel the tension. However, they were still watching her. There was a smile on Feng Ling's face, and her expression did not change. She had just taken the hangover medicine and drank a few mouthfuls of wine, so it was not a big problem. She smiled as she gently placed the wine glass in her hand on the tea table. She then picked up a piece of watermelon from the fruit platter and took 2 bites. She smiled with a harmless expression on her face. Just when everyone was wondering if something had happened when Paul went out with her, the 2 men beside David had already reached into their clothes and were about to pull out their guns. Feng Ling glanced at their movements, but acted as though she hadn't seen anything. She spat out the watermelon seed on her hand and gently placed it on a piece of tissue by the side. Her movements appeared slow and careful, as though she was unaware of the murderous intent in the air. All of a sudden, the music in the private room abruptly stopped, and the lights dimmed. This sudden darkness caused everyone to instantly become vigilant. What's going on? Is there a power outage? Or is there an ambush? Just as the voice fell, someone quickly picked up his phone and turned on the flashlight function on his phone. After a trace of light was restored in the private room, the other people next to him also took out their phones and did the same. Just when the light in the private room was enough to see everyone clearly, David turned to look at the young lady in the white dress. She didn't seem to have done anything in that instant of darkness. She only took out her phone with a flustered expression and fiddled with it in her hand. She also hurriedly turned on the flashlight function. Then she looked at them with a flustered expression and asked in a small voice, "Is there a power outage?" If this little girl in the white dress was really planted by someone, or had some kind of conspiracy, she would definitely have done something in the few seconds of darkness just now. However, when they saw her unprepared expression, and how she reached for her phone helplessly like everyone else, they instantly dispelled their suspicions. Since she hadn't returned for so long, something must have happened to Paul. However, the problem shouldn't be with this woman. Go and ask. David's hand was already in his pocket. He held onto his gun and was prepared to respond immediately if anything happened. The others also held their phones in one hand to illuminate the room and prepared to take out their weapons with the other. Someone stood up and went out to ask. The little bartender happened to be nearby. He hurriedly came in with his phone and bowed apologetically. "Apologies. There's a problem with the wiring in the bar. The entire bar has been cut off. We've already contacted the nearest wiring repairman. Someone will be here to fix it immediately. Within 10 minutes, all the lights will be restored." "Are you sure it's just a problem with the wiring?" David was black. In this dark private room, with the light from all the phones, his body and facial features couldn't be seen clearly. Only a pair of cold and sharp eyes filled with killing intent stood out. At the same time, they sent chills down one's spine. It was as though a pair of eyes had appeared out of thin air in the darkness. It was extremely terrifying. Yes, it's been raining in Los Angeles for the past few days. It's likely that the wiring outside the bar is too old. You should know that all the buildings in this red light district have been around for many years. Those wiring will more or less be affected by such weather. Don't worry, the repairman will be here soon. It won't take too long. The little bartender finished speaking and directly picked up his phone to make a call. He urged, "Are they here yet? Hurry up." Feng Ling looked in the direction of the little bartender. Could it be that there was a plan that she didn't know about? Was there really something wrong with the wiring? Or what was going on? Just a few minutes after the little bartender finished the call, footsteps sounded from outside. Then, the little bartender anxiously said something. Afterward, a tall man dressed in the uniform of a certain Los Angeles electric company walked in with a wiring box on his back. Chapter 846. It was Li Nanheng. She only glanced at the man who had just walked in. The man did not look at her. Instead, he turned around very professionally to check the power control box inside the private room. At this time, the bartender also came in and explained with an apologetic smile. "Everyone, please wait a moment. It will be ready soon. The repairmen have arrived. There are also a few people who are going to check the main power supply of the bar. We specially called one of them over to check if the wires in this private room are burnt. It will be fixed soon." What a waste of time. An impatient voice came from the private room, and then a group of people stood by the sofa and stared at the back of the man squatting in front of the power control box. Even though Li Nanheng's clothes looked very professional, and even the way he opened the power control box was absolutely not a problem, but among the group of people who entered the private room, a few of them deliberately glanced at him when they passed by behind him. Staring at David's back under the light of the phone, one of them took a step back and slowly walked to David's back, whispering something in David's ear. David immediately glanced at the repairman again. Without speaking, he slowly raised his hand and made a gesture to move forward. In an instant, the people next to David took out their guns, lightened their footsteps, and slowly moved behind Li Nanheng. They were not sure if there was a problem with this person, or if they had seen wrongly before, but they had already made full preparations. As long as this repairman made the slightest movement that would threaten them, they would immediately be shot to death, and there would be no room for resistance. The man who was checking the power control box kept shining the light of his cell phone on the wires and circuit boards inside, took out very professional tools from the box at hand, and unscrewed the plugs and connectors on the solder plates inside. He didn't look back, as if he was unaware of the danger behind him. In order to see the situation inside the power control box more clearly, he even bent down, knelt on one knee, and stuck his head in to check. Seeing this repairman's professional posture, there didn't seem to be any problem. David stared at him coldly, playing with the gun in his pocket, and didn't ask his men to shoot immediately. After all, if it was really a repairman, the power must be restored immediately. When they first came here, they came in small groups to avoid detection. Now that there were so many of them here, it would be too much trouble and too obvious if they wanted to move somewhere else. If it wasn't a repairman, it meant that this person was very dangerous. Then they had to be even more careful. On the other side of the sofa, Feng Ling moved her eyes away from Li Nanheng's back and watched helplessly as those people pointed their guns at her. But now was not the time for her to send out a signal, and as long as she made any movements at this time, Boss Li's life would be instantly buried under those people's muzzles. While those people weren't paying too much attention to her, she turned to glance at the bartender. The bartender didn't say a word after seeing those people's actions. It was as if he was just protecting himself and wouldn't join hands with anyone else, nor was he anyone's informant. He just quietly retreated to the side. Seeing the bartender like this, Feng Ling received an invisible hint from him. Now was not the time to start a war. She needed to continue hiding, keeping calm, and continuing to act. However, there was still no sound coming from the washroom. It was likely that the bartender had found a way to close the washroom on this floor. No one could get in, and no one would be able to find Paul, who had fainted with blood all over his face. At this time, David tilted his head and lit another cigar. He put his hand in his pocket, his fingers on the butt of the gun, and his dark face looked in the direction of the repairman for a full 4 minutes. "It's not fixed yet?" David asked coldly at this time. His eyes were already clearly impatient. "Most of the problem lies in the main power supply. We need our people to connect the main power supply line, before this place can be restored. The repairman, who was squatting there and changing the wire, did not look back. He directly answered, "But it's indeed because the wire was burned. I think there will be a burnt red wire in the circuit in every private room. I'll change this one first. After the main power supply is connected, everything will be fine." As he spoke, he took out a red power cord from the box. Seeing the red wire in his hand, the bartender finally shifted his gaze and glanced at Feng Ling from the corner of his eyes. After Feng Ling received his gaze, she first looked at the waist and abdomen of the nearest short man from the corner of her eyes. Feng Ling received the hint, slowly took a step back, leaned against the sofa, and glanced sideways at the short man's clothes. Just now she noticed that there was a bulge on his waist. Now, after the bartender's hint, it seemed that the explosive device that these terrorists often use to spontaneously ignite and self-destruct in times of danger was tied to this man's body. Usually, their explosive device could spread within 100 meters, and a person with an explosive device on his body was enough to die with the people around him. In such a situation tonight, although they wouldn't seek death and would only think of ways to protect themselves based on their usual habits, there would definitely be someone with such a thing on his body. In order to let all the members of 11 Base come into support, she must be the one to remove the explosive device and ensure that all the members of 11 Base would not be destroyed here. This was the second task of her tonight. It was more important than the task of snooping because it concerned the safety of the members of the base and the degree of completion of this task. Li Nanheng had already begun to install the red wire. Feng Ling's hand was behind her back, and she slowly took out a very small but very sharp dagger hidden in her skirt. This was given to her by Boss Li when she returned to the private room. When she first came in, because he would search her body, she couldn't bring it with her. She was originally considering how to deal with the subsequent situation without a weapon on her. But in the end, not only did she get a gun from Paul, but also because Boss Li suddenly took the risk to come in, he gave her a dagger. Chapter 847. It was too dark in the private room, and all the cell phone lights were aimed at Li Nanheng. On the other side, Feng Ling stood in the dark. No one would know that in the blink of an eye, one of their companions had died in Feng Ling's hands. The short man didn't even have the chance to scream before his throat was severed. His eyes widened as he tried to call for help, but he couldn't make a sound at all. He stared at her for a few seconds before he lost the strength to reach out to his companions due to the pain and numbness in his back. He fell to the ground silently. The moment he fell, Feng Ling raised her hand to catch him. She did not care that the other party's blood had already stained her dress. She let the short man, who had already died silently, stand by her side in a trembling posture. Without arousing suspicion, she reached the dagger behind him, cut open his clothes, and slowly used the dagger to cut the wire on the explosive device on his waist. At the same time, she used the dagger to cut the detonator of the explosive device. After she was done, she slowly turned her gaze to the bartender standing by the door. The bartender caught her gaze and suddenly took a step back. The gazes of the dozen or so people in the private room immediately turned to look at him. Just as the bartender's back was partially exposed outside the door, a burst of music suddenly rang out from the dance floor of the bar. It seems that the power in the bar hall has been restored. The bartender said impatiently, "Hurry up, install the wire now. Don't waste time." Everything was still going on in the dark. However, the smell of blood coming from the short man's body made the two closest companions discover the problem first. "There's blood. Whose blood is it?" Suddenly, the two people's cell phones shone in Feng Ling's direction. The moment they saw the obvious bloodstains on Feng Ling's white dress, the people in the private room immediately shifted their attention to her. Even the hand that had been holding the gun in his pocket instantly pulled out his gun. He pulled the trigger and aimed at the seemingly innocent and harmless girl standing there, but her white dress was mostly dyed red. Almost at the moment when Feng Ling attracted all the attention in the private room, the huge widescreen television screen in the private room suddenly flashed. The dazzling red and yellow light dazzled their eyes, and then the sound of electric current came from the speaker. "Be careful, There's really an ambush. The man who was holding a gun beside David suddenly shouted at this moment. At this moment, Feng Ling dragged the short man covered in blood, who had been standing beside her in front of her. While blocking their shots, she quickly and neatly took out a gun from her skirt and dodged the two men who were pouncing at her. She raised her leg and gave a fatal kick to the back of the man's neck. Then she turned her hand and fired, instantly killing two of them. He never expected that such a beautiful and slender woman would be so agile and fierce. David cursed in a low voice, and his eyes were bloodshot. Suddenly, all the targets in the room charged toward Feng Ling. In the blink of an eye, the man who had been squatting beside the power control box slowly put away the pliers and various tools in his hands. The people who had been surrounding him looked at him coldly and turned to look in the direction of the girl in the white dress, who was able to avoid being surrounded by so many people. At the moment when their attention shifted slightly, Li Nanhing's hand suddenly pressed the red button in the power control box. In an instant, the corridor outside was still pitch black, but the private room suddenly lit up with dazzling red and yellow lights. At the same time, ear-piercing alarms kept ringing, loud enough for the people lurking outside the bar to hear instantly. The people in the private room were shocked by the sudden glaring light and the sound. They could only shout, "Not good," before they could finish their words. Their heads were suddenly hit hard, and they fell to the ground with blood flowing out of their heads. Li Nanhing knocked down the person closest to him, then grabbed another person's wrist and twisted it hard. There was a crisp sound of the wrist bone breaking. At the same time, he grabbed the gun and bent down to avoid the bullet shooting toward him. At the same time, he bent his other arm and used his elbow to attack the other person's abdomen. He then grabbed the shoulder of another person who was pouncing toward him, and with a backhand throw, he was ruthlessly thrown toward the group of people who were pouncing toward him. Catch! Li Nanheng took out a gun from his clothes with one hand, and at the same time, he threw the gun he had just snatched in his other hand toward the door of the private room. The bartender, who had been standing there shivering, quickly caught the gun. In an instant, he shot and killed the person who was about to come over to seal the door. He then quickly walked in to help Feng Ling, who was surrounded by a large group of people. Although Li Nanheng and the bartender had already attracted the attention of most of the people, the dozen or so people surrounding Feng Ling still did not give up. David in particular did not dare to believe that he had actually been schemed against by a little girl. He was enraged to the extreme. As a terrorist, he was not afraid of death, so he disregarded everything and continued to target her. The alarm kept ringing, causing them to feel annoyed. 11 Base had training on bright lights, so Feng Ling was not affected by the ear-piercing sound and the dazzling red and yellow lights. She looked at the dazzled people and smiled coldly. She shot one of them in the abdomen and took the opportunity to grab the other person's hair and throw him forward. When he fell beside the legs of the people who were rushing over, she raised her hand and fired several shots. However, these shots were all successfully avoided by them. She dodged and retreated again, but she was forced to the corner of the private room by them. Li Nanheng and the bartender dealt with the 7 or 8 people behind this group of people. When he saw Feng Ling's direction, Li Nanheng abruptly rushed over, grabbed one of them, and dragged him to the side. Bullets shot out from his hands, and the moment the elites of 11 Base rushed in, he took the lead to push the crowd away and pulled Feng Ling, who had been forced into a corner, into his arms. Feng Ling saw that the gun in David's hand was already aimed at her head, but she was suddenly pulled away by Li Nanheng. Her body was uncontrollably turned by the man, and her head instinctively leaned against Li Nanheng's chest. However, she suddenly heard the sound of a bullet grazing through flesh and blood, and then it shot past her ear, causing a strand of hair that was not covered by the wig to flutter. Chapter 848. As she spoke, she looked down and saw that there was a cut on the sleeve of the man's arm, which was wrapped around her back. "It's okay. Let's go." As if he couldn't feel the pain, Li Nanheng used his other uninjured arm to push Feng Ling hard into the crowd of elites of the base, turned around, kicked away the people who had already pounced on him, and raised his hand to shoot again. Feng Ling quickly regained her senses and went in with the people of the base to subdue the terrorists. Because the wig on her head was too much of a hindrance, she pulled off the wig and threw it hard on the enemy's face. Then she took advantage of the fact that the enemy couldn't see her and rushed forward to attack. While holding a bullet, she shot directly in David's direction. This shot hit David's back. David resisted the pain and turned around, but at the moment he turned around, Li Nanheng on the other side also shot at him. This shot hit his shoulder, and then Li Nanheng shot David's wrist that was holding the gun. At the same time, Feng Ling stepped forward, kicked away the man next to her, raised the gun, and shot both of David's legs. She and Li Nanheng tacitly didn't hit David's vital parts. He was the leader of these terrorists. It was better to keep him alive and hand him over to the military for interrogation. David fell to the ground. His arms and legs were already dripping with blood. He was in so much pain that his entire body twitched. He suddenly bit his tongue hard. Li Nanheng pushed the person who attacked him away with one hand. Because he could not free himself to go over, he gave Feng Ling a look from afar. Feng Ling nodded and stepped forward to pinch David's chin. She grabbed a plastic bag wrapped in tissue from the blood-stained coffee table and stuffed it into his mouth. She then kicked his abdomen hard. David immediately widened his eyes at her short hair and then at her dress. He did not dare to believe it, as though he was not sure if she was a man or a woman. She was clearly a woman, but why did she have short hair? Feng Ling just glanced at him coldly, picked him up, and threw him to the people of the base. This hotel was run by terrorists. After the incident in the private room, all of the terrorists' accomplices either rushed in with guns or hurriedly fled. All of them were pinned down on the spot by the base's people. Not even a fly in the bar could escape. She knew that his arm was injured when he saved her, but now was not the time to care about his injury. She stood there and thought for a moment, looked at the car parked outside, asked a member of the base for the car key, and drove back to the base alone. She had to go back first, because her dress had been torn in the fight just now. This dress was too thin. If she returned with Boss Lee in the car, it would be easy for him to notice that something was wrong with her body. For example, her breasts were not silicone at all. Through the rearview mirror, she saw that the bar was getting further and further away from her. She continued to step on the accelerator and quickly left. 5 minutes after Feng Ling left, Li Nanheng came out of the private room and thought of something. He glanced at the people around him, but did not see the figure in the white dress. He only saw the long, short hair that fell on the floor of the private room. "Where did Feng Ling go?" he asked coldly. The member of the base standing in the corridor glanced out and replied, "Boss, Feng Ling said that he was not comfortable in that suit. Since there is no problem here, he will go back to the base first." Li Nanheng's hand, which was about to take out a cigarette from his pocket, suddenly paused, and he unconsciously raised his head to look out of the bar. He caught a glimpse of the speeding cars and pedestrians outside the bar. He did not speak immediately. His slender fingers took out a cigarette, lit it, and put it to his mouth. He lowered his eyes, exhaled a mouthful of white smoke, and said coldly, "Why are you in such a hurry to return to the base?" It's probably because a man wearing a woman's clothes was uncomfortable during the mission. Now that the mission is over, he is in a hurry to go back. The member of the base immediately chuckled. But speaking of which, Feng Ling's clothes really fit him. I almost believe that he is a real girl. A real girl? The man suddenly remembered the feeling on his hand when he pressed Feng Ling against the wall outside the bathroom and kissed her. It was so soft and real that it didn't feel like a pair of fake breasts at all. It even felt a little familiar. It seemed to be the night he broke into Kay's room when he was drunk. He was not sure if it was a dream or a real feeling. But he was sober just now and knew whether it was a dream or real. A man? A woman? At this moment, Li Nanheng's eyes were slightly cold. The operation that might have taken a whole night to complete was successfully completed in the first half of the night, and the members of the base rushed back to the base. Only Li Nanheng's arm was slightly injured. At that time, the bullet passed through the side of his arm. Although it didn't hit inside, it brushed against the side of his arm, leaving a bloodstain more than 1 centimeter deep. When he was in the car, he simply wiped it with gauze. After returning to the base, although he didn't take it seriously, he was still persuaded by the base members to go to the base infirmary to disinfect and bandage it. The car didn't stop after driving into the base. When passing by their residence, Li Nanheng glanced at the light in Feng Ling's room out of the corner of his eye. The car quickly drove past and went straight in the direction of the infirmary. After dealing with the wound in the infirmary, about half an hour later, Li Nanheng returned to his residence. After coming back, Feng Ling took a shower and habitually did balance training before going to bed. Then she was about to open the window to breathe, panting, when she suddenly heard a knock on the door. She paused and turned to look at the door. At the same time, she glanced at the things in the trash can next to her, walked over, and opened the door. The moment she opened the door, the smell of blood on the man's body didn't diminish. Feng Ling, who had washed away the smell of blood and was wearing a large white t-shirt, looked at Li Nanheng, who only had a circle of gauze wrapped around his arm and still hadn't changed his clothes. Even so, the man didn't look the slightest bit disheveled. Instead, his coldness made her heart tremble. "Boss," Feng Ling said respectfully without any change in expression. Li Nanheng looked at her with dark eyes and glanced at her slightly red and swollen lips. His eyes were deep, and he didn't speak, but took a step forward. Feng Ling paused, subconsciously moved her hand away from the door, and took a step back, keeping an appropriate distance. The man looked at her coldly. When he took another step forward, she took another step back. Chapter 849. Feng Ling thought she had heard it wrong. She froze and stared at the man in front of her. Li Nanheng didn't intend to talk nonsense with her at all. "I asked you to take off your clothes, understand?" Feng Ling. "Why?" "A few years ago, the year you came to the base, I went to an orphanage in Los Angeles and found a child dressed as a man. But I didn't see her face at that time, so I don't know who she is." Speaking of this, Li Nanheng's eyes fell lightly on her body, and his eyes fell on her chest without warning. Even though the man was full of the smell of blood and looked embarrassed, it didn't affect his identity and arrogant aura at all. Any one of his words had an absolute deterrent force and the courage to make others obey him. Hearing him suddenly mention that matter, although Feng Ling wasn't sure, she felt that Boss Li was beginning to suspect her. In the past, he just didn't have evidence and was not sure, so he didn't particularly insist on digging out the matter that seemed to have nothing to do with him. But at this moment, Boss Li obviously didn't have any intention of letting her go or giving her a chance. He had to know the truth. "Boss, do you mean that you think I'm the person you met in that orphanage?" Feng Ling looked at him calmly. "How did you find out that she was a woman dressed as a man? Could it be that you took off her clothes? Or did you force me to take off my clothes to prove my identity like what you are doing now?" Feng Ling said this calmly, as if the person he was talking about was not her. She didn't even feel anything and just asked him, "Or do you think that the perception of the entire base, including all the drill masters who have been in contact with me, is very low? After living together in the base for so many years, you don't even know whether I am a man or not. Do I need you to force me to take off my clothes to prove myself? I just asked you to take off your clothes. If you are a man, do it. Don't be so shy." Li Nanheng slowly mentioned her usual behavior. "Who in the base have you taken a bath with? Have you been to the public bath in the base? After training for a long time in the summer, all of you brats have taken off your shirts and sweated on the training ground naked. You're the only one who's neatly dressed and hasn't even untied your belt. Plus your height and your usual performance. As the person in charge of the base, I'm qualified to figure this out. It's not too much." Hearing this, Feng Ling immediately smiled. "Boss, you should know that there is a kind of fetish in this world called exhibitionism, and I am the opposite. Exhibitionism is a kind of fetish. I am too cautious and self-defensive like me. Or, I can explain it this way." At this moment, Feng Ling glanced at the trash can by the bed and said mildly, "When I was young, I wandered around without parents. Perhaps because I was born like a girl, with fair and thin skin, I was often bullied by the local American vagrants on the streets. I was even dragged into the alley by a few vagrants, and had my clothes stripped off and humiliated on the street. As a result, my personality was shrouded in a layer of shadow. I was wary of everyone and hated to interact with others. I also hated to take off my clothes in front of others. Hearing her explanation, Li Nanheng looked at her deeply and didn't speak. But because of her gaze, he turned his head and looked at the trash can by her bed. In the trash can was the white dress Feng Ling wore on the mission today. The dress was stained with a lot of dirty blood. There was also a pair of high heels, flesh-colored stockings, and a pair of silicone flesh-colored fake breasts. Seeing the pair of silicone things with his own eyes, Li Nanheng's hands in his trouser pocket paused. Feng Ling stood in front of him and watched his boss's eyes gradually turn cold. She raised her arms expressionlessly and made a gesture of letting him take off her clothes at will. If boss must see it, as you said, we are all men. I won't lose a piece of flesh just by looking at it. The room became abnormally quiet because of Feng Ling's words. Li Nanheng moved his eyes away from the things in the trash can, glanced at her indifferently, and then glanced at her wide t-shirt, open arms and flat chest. His eyes instantly became much colder, and his low voice was filled with irresistible coldness. In your eyes, is your boss a psychopath who disregards your psychological shadow and insists on watching you take off your clothes? Or will he give up his goal because of a casual explanation and past? Or, do you think I will believe your reasons? Feng Ling's eyes were calm. Boss is boss. The base has given me a place to live. If boss must be serious about this, of course, I won't refuse. As for whether you believe it or not, that's your business. Her eyes were firm and unwavering. For her, it was no longer important whether Boss Li knew whether she was a man or a woman. What was important was how much he trusted her. After working together for so long, and going through fire and water for so many times, gender was not important to her. So what if he was a man? So what if he was a woman? At first, she didn't want to be driven out of the base, because she was a woman. Of course, this was also the reason now. But when Xiao Su said that Boss Li liked her, Feng Ling's heart had not calmed down yet. If he insisted on being the person to reveal this secret, she might not refuse. She was only calm. When she finished speaking, her arms were still stretched out. She looked at him calmly and fearlessly. Boss, do you want to take off your clothes? How shrewd was Li Nanheng? At this moment, there seemed to be thousands of things reminding him that there was something wrong with Feng Ling. Whether it was her overly reserved performance, or the touch he had kissed. If he couldn't tell whether she was a man or a woman, he would have lived in vain for more than 20 years. But Feng Ling's eyes were too calm. The truth was in front of him. Should he reveal it or not? At this moment, Li Nanheng turned his eyes away, and looked at all the furnishings on her bed and in her room. Every step was very simple. There were a few books on the table, the bed was neat and clean, and most of the clothes hanging in the cabinet were black or white t-shirts and uniforms. There was nothing feminine. Perhaps it was too cruel to reveal the truth personally. People needed to trust each other, but it also needed honesty. Li Nanheng looked at her again, his eyes slightly cold. I will only give you this chance. Who are you? Are you a man or a woman? Tell me the truth. Feng Ling did not hesitate. Feng Ling male. Chapter 850. Feng Ling could clearly feel the changes around her, especially the cold aura emanating from the man in front of her. Looking at Feng Ling's calm expression, Li Nanheng smiled. His thin lips were cold, and he ground his teeth hard. A man? Feng Ling looked at him without blinking. Boss, do you really want me to be a woman? Not really. He looked at her face expressionlessly and said lightly, I just need an honest person. Feng Ling's throat seemed to be blocked by something. When she raised her eyes to understand what he meant through his eyes, the man had turned around and said coldly, If you are a man, remember that you are a man. With that, the man walked out without looking back. Feng Ling froze in place and watched the door close automatically. Why did she feel that Boss Li seemed to know it? But how could he be so sure of her gender? Did she show any flaws today? She had touched the pair of silicone fake breasts just now, which felt soft and elastic. In fact, it was not much different from the real ones. Even if there was a difference, It was impossible for him to completely distinguish the difference under such circumstances. But his eyes just now late at night, Feng Ling lay on the bed. She should have fallen asleep, but she had insomnia. Li Nanheng's words kept echoing in her mind. I just need an honest person. She even remembered the scene in the bar of terrorists, when Li Nanheng rushed into the crowd to hold the person, who was almost shot in his arms, and quickly turned around to block the bullet for her. She remembered the white gauze on his arm. After closing her eyes for about half an hour, she suddenly opened her eyes again. In the blink of an eye, it was already very late, and the entire 11 base was already silent. But she couldn't sleep. Those voices and scenes kept repeating in her mind. She suddenly sat up, picked up the cushion for balance training, and lay on the ground. After about 15 minutes, her forehead was already sweating. She took 2 deep breaths, sat on the cushion, and stared at the night sky outside the balcony in a daze. Balance training was very easy to sweat. After only 15 minutes of training, her body was already wet and sticky. She looked outside until her neck was a little stiff. She got up and went into the bathroom to take a simple shower. After showering, she didn't rush to wrap her chest. She just stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bathroom and looked at the naked girl in the mirror. She stared at her lips, which still felt a little numb, and then looked down at her well-proportioned and perfect body. She didn't know what kind of body was considered a good body among girls. She only knew that when she wore women's clothes last time and today, she seemed to look good indeed. Even if she wore long hair or short hair, it didn't affect the thick and almost unconcealable girlish feeling. Was it because of this that Li Nanheng no longer believed her words? Did she really expose her secret so easily? But looking at his attitude, he didn't know what was going on. Did he really know? Or is it just a guess? Feng Ling didn't understand a lot of things, and she didn't even know what love was. She had never been aware of gender since she was a child. After being a man for a long time, she had never thought about being a woman, and didn't seem to feel that being a woman had any other meaning. So when Li Nanheng asked her, she still answered that she was a man. But when Li Nanheng turned to leave, his eyes were piercingly cold, which made her feel uneasy. She didn't know what kind of feeling it was. She only knew that she couldn't sleep. The next day, it was a routine training at the base. In the training ground of the sniper team, 5 people stood in a row and were doing physical training. Xiao Fei watched them do the exercises one by one and sternly demanded that everyone must reach the standard within an hour. It rained yesterday, but today it was sunny. It was probably the last hot weather before autumn. Under the sunlight, Li Nanheng's figure appeared on the training ground. Usually, Boss Li would come over occasionally to watch them train, so everyone was used to it. They shouted "Boss" in unison and continued to do the exercises seriously. Feng Ling glanced at Li Nanheng, but the man's eyes did not fall on her. He just stood there coldly and indifferently watching them train without speaking. The black uniform was very loose, and she couldn't see anything on his arm, but Feng Ling knew that the gauze on his arm should be wrapped inside and covered by his clothes. She didn't know how serious the injury was. Last night, she came back early and didn't go to the infirmary with him. She could only see that Boss Li's expression didn't seem to be wrong, and felt that it shouldn't be too serious. But yesterday, the sound of the bullet grazing his flesh was very clear. She stared at the man's arm. When Xiao Fei asked them to do the second exercise, her movements slowed for a moment. Xiao Fei's eyes suddenly turned to her. Feng Ling. Feng Ling came back to herself, stood up abruptly, and turned to continue with the others with a solemn expression. She didn't look in that direction again. Xiao Fei turned to look at Li Nanheng. Seeing that Boss Li looked as usual, he thought for a while and didn't say anything. He walked forward and continued to lead them to do exercises. When he came behind Feng Ling, he raised her stretched arm and whispered, "Why do you look so pale? You are not in a good state today." Feng Ling's eyes remained serious and she replied in a low voice, "I didn't sleep well last night." Xiao Fei glanced at her again. Sure enough, there were a little dark circles under her eyes, but not very serious. It could be seen that Feng Ling, who never stayed up late, almost didn't sleep last night. Seeing her listless but determined look, Xiao Fei turned to walk to the others. After about 10 minutes, he said, "All right, take a break for half an hour. We'll continue after half an hour." Kay looked surprised. "Didn't you say that we must reach the standard posture within an hour? How long has it been since the morning training started? Is it the new year or something good? When did the training time arrangement in the base become so humane?" Xiao Fei squinted at him. "If you don't want to rest, you can continue to practice. I'll check your performance in an hour." Kay immediately put down his stretched arm. "No, I said I'll rest. Brother Qiao, you can't go back on your word." Xiao Fei glanced at him again, and then looked at Feng Ling. Hearing that she was going to rest, he saw that she had put down her arm, turned around, and walked to the bench that was usually used to rest and sit down. Chapter 851. Xiao Fei paused and was about to speak, but Li Nanheng had already walked over without looking back. Feng Ling was sitting on the chair to rest, and wanted to close her eyes for a while. However, as soon as she closed her eyes, she suddenly felt a heavy pressure in front of her. She suddenly opened her eyes, and looked up to see the person who caused her to lose sleep for a whole night. Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket and lowered his eyes. His eyes were pitch black, and his healthy skin color appeared much whiter under the blazing sun. He looked like a vampire aristocrat under the sun, especially when he stood with his back to the light. His indifferent and lazy aura was even more prominent. "Didn't you say that your physical fitness is up to standard? How long has it been since morning training? Why are you so tired that you need to sit here and sleep?" Hearing his words, the fatigue in Feng Ling's eyes disappeared in an instant. She didn't want to mention that she didn't sleep well last night, and just said, "Drillmaster Qiao said to let me rest. I just sit here for a while, and take advantage of the limited time to replenish my strength." Li Nanheng's eyes were slightly cold. "Get up." Feng Ling stood up. "Continue to practice." Feng Ling glanced at the other 4 people who were resting, and then at the empty training ground. Deputy Drillmaster Qiao said, "Is Qiao Fei the boss or am I the boss?" The moment the man heard the words Deputy Drillmaster Qiao, his eyes burst into coldness. Feng Ling felt as though the hot air above her head had turned cold at this moment. She raised her eyes to look at him, but the man's gaze shifted away and did not land on her. However, it was clear that his order for her to continue practicing was effective. Feng Ling was silent for a moment and didn't say more. She turned back to the middle of the training ground and continued to practice alone. Xiao Fei turned to get a bottle of mineral water and came back. When he turned his head, he saw that Feng Ling suddenly went to practice again. He was surprised and asked from a distance, "Didn't I say to let you rest for half an hour? Why are you practicing alone?" Feng Ling didn't answer, and Xiao Fei felt something was wrong. Then he turned to see Boss Li standing not far from her with his arms crossed, and expressionlessly watching her practice. At this time, Tam also leaned over to Kay and whispered, "What happened? Did Feng Ling offend Boss Li?" Kay didn't understand. He looked at Feng Ling, and then at Boss Li, whose head was engraved with the words, "Don't mess with me today," and sighed. I don't know. Of course he didn't know. He clearly remembered that Boss was very kind to Feng Ling. But why did he seem to be against her today? Kay suddenly didn't quite understand the relationship between men. After all, Boss was present, and it was clearly an order from Boss, so Xiao Fei couldn't say anything. He could only walk over and take a look before saying, "Stop practicing for now. Come drink some water." As he spoke, he turned to hand the other bottles of water to the other 4 people, and then to Boss Li, thinking that he would give it to Feng Ling and let her rest for a while. However, when the bottle was handed to Nanheng, he phased. To Li at Ling up to him. Up. To Li up. Nanheng. Ling to Boss Fei Li Chi. Ling to him. To he. At Fei. Feng Ling raised his eyebrows and didn't feel embarrassed. He took back the water, played with it casually in his hand and said, "Feng Ling, come here and drink some water." Feng Ling let out a long breath. "Okay," she continued. Seeing that Boss's face was as cold as frost, Feng Ling didn't seem to be in a good state. But she didn't say anything. She didn't say anything even if she was tired, thirsty or hot. She just stood there and continued to practice. Half an hour later, the rest time passed, and the other 4 people returned to the field, but Feng Ling was still not allowed to stop. The morning passed, and it was nearly 11 o'clock. They had practiced for several hours. The others had taken a break in the middle, but Feng Ling, who was in the worst state, didn't even take a break, and had been practicing until now. Xiao Fei didn't know what to say at first, but seeing the scorching sun, he couldn't help turning to Li Nanheng and saying, "Boss, it's almost noon. Let them take a break and go have lunch. Otherwise it's autumn. If they get a heat stroke, it's really not good. Do you think 11 Base is a resort? If they're tired, they can rest. If they're hungry, they can eat. If they're sweating, do you want me to arrange for them to soak in a hot spring?" The noble and handsome face on Li Nanheng's face seemed to be broken under the scorching sun, leaving only a sense of oppression that made people feel uneasy and cold. But Feng Ling, is there something special about him? So special that you need to take care of him? Li Nanheng's eyes fell on his face, and his voice sounded light and light. His voice was so low that only Xiao Fei could hear it. Or do you know something? His voice was very low, but when Xiao Fei looked into his eyes were full of coldness. Know what? Boss, it's very basic to care about the members of the sniper team. Li Nanheng suddenly smiled, but his eyes were cold. I've warned you more than once. Put away your excessive care. 11 Base doesn't need trash. Feng Ling has performed very well in all kinds of tasks, big or small, and his physical fitness is much better than when he first entered the base. How could he be trash? He's even better than many newcomers who entered the base at the same time. I'm sure I'm not the only one who emphasized this matter. When Li Nanheng turned around expressionlessly, Xiao Fei took a step forward and stood in front of him. Also, what do you mean by I know something? Is there something that Feng Ling can't tell others? Or is there something that I don't know that needs boss to specially remind me? Li Nanheng looked indifferent and pushed his shoulder away. You'd better not know. With that, he turned and walked out of the training ground. Xiao Fei looked at his back calmly, suppressed his temper, and asked again, "Let them go to the canteen to rest before 12 o'clock, okay?" The man did not answer. His back was as cold as the snow on the top of the mountain, and his footsteps were already far away. Xiao Fei withdrew his gaze, turned his eyes to Feng Ling, who was still insisting on training, and sighed. What happened? This last couldn't have been discovered by boss, right? Half an hour later, at 12 o'clock, Xiao Fei let them go to rest first, and then go to the canteen for lunch. When they arrived at the base's canteen, Feng Ling's head was buzzing, because she didn't sleep well last night, and had a whole morning of intensive training. Xiao Fei saw that she was not in a good state even when she was holding the plate, so he asked her to sit down first, and helped her to scoop the rice. Not long after, he placed her plate full of food in front of her. Feng Ling raised her eyes to say thank you, and from the corner of her eyes, she suddenly saw a car quickly driving past outside the canteen. Chapter 852. That car was red, which she had never seen in the base, and it didn't seem to be a car of the base. She just glanced out, and didn't have the energy to pay attention to it. She picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. At this time, several members of the base who were eating lunch were whispering, "Is Dr. Wen's sister here again?" The other brothers didn't say anything. They just smiled at the car that had gone far away. Then, they looked at each other, as if they were gossiping. Feng Ling glanced in their direction. Dr. Wen was the resident doctor in the infirmary of the base. It was Dr. Wen who examined her when she fainted and her leg was injured. He was a very gentle and fair-skinned male doctor in his 30s. People who could work in 11 Base for a long time were not ordinary people. It was said that Dr. Wen's family had some relations with the military in the United States, and he had brothers and sisters, but she seldom went to the infirmary. The base was also full of men, so she didn't know much about other people's families. Feng Ling lowered her head and focused on eating, because she had a hunch that such intensive training would not stop in a short time. After eating, she left the cafeteria and didn't feel any changes in the base because of Dr. Wen's sister's visit. She went straight back to the training ground. There wasn't much training time this afternoon, so she could go back to her residence in 2 hours. However, when Feng Ling was about to go back, She received a notice to return to the training ground to continue training. This notice was called by another drill master of the sniper team. Xiao Fei didn't know it, and Li Nanhing didn't come in person. Feng Ling took the phone call and knew that her hunch was right, but she didn't know how she offended Boss Li. When she returned to the training ground, she saw Boss Li standing there. The devil training in the past came to her mind again. This time, Feng Ling was mentally prepared. She stood behind the man. Boss. Li Nanhing looked back and glanced at her. Yes. It felt as if she was greeting the Grim Reaper. And the Grim Reaper knew that she was well aware of it. She didn't even need to explain. She only needed to greet her calmly. Boss, I know I'm not in a good state this morning, and the new movements I learned are not very good. Feng Ling said, Thank you, boss, for wasting your time to train me alone. Li Nanhing's expression didn't change. He nodded indifferently. He turned around and gave her the middle seat. When he turned around again, the man glanced at the clothes she was still wearing. Understanding his gaze, Feng Ling explained, I guess that because of my poor performance today, boss would call me out. Anyway, I'll still sweat. There's no need to change my clothes before coming over. On one hand, there was the smell of sweat on her body, so she probably didn't want to get close to her as much as when she was wearing women's clothes yesterday. Boss would probably dislike her and wouldn't get too close to her. On the other hand, she had this premonition, so she was too lazy to change her clothes. This was quite good. At least because of Boss's misophobia, she could maintain an appropriate distance. Regardless of whether he had guessed something or not, it was better to stay as far away from him as possible. As if he understood her purpose at a glance, Li Nanhing stood on the edge of the training ground, his long legs still, his left hand in his trouser pocket, and his deep eyes fell on her cautious and calm face. First, do balance exercises for an hour, then do 100 push-ups. After that, we'll continue with the other physical events. As Li Nanhing spoke, his black military boots ruthlessly stepped over the white line on the edge of the training ground and retreated to the side of the bench. The sun was blazing in the afternoon. Feng Ling had just experienced a hair-raising disguise in the bar yesterday. She hadn't slept all night and had undergone a whole morning of intensive training. Right now, she wasn't sure if she could maintain her balance for an hour. However, seeing Boss's expression, she still silently followed his instructions. Seeing that the boy didn't say anything and just lay in the middle of the training ground silently as always, Li Nanhing's eyes were slightly cold, and he looked down at the boy who was lying on his stomach and then half propped up with his arms. At this time, Han Jin and Xiao Su passed by the sniper team's training ground. Seeing that there were people inside, they subconsciously looked in this direction. What the hell? What was going on? Why did Boss give Feng Ling intensive training again? Didn't they just fight with terrorists yesterday? Under normal circumstances, after completing a dangerous mission, the members of the base should have at least 2 or 3 days of vacation. Why didn't Feng Ling give them a vacation today, but he was also given intensive training? Li Nanhing suddenly took off the black uniform draped over his back, threw it on the bench, and glanced outside. Xiao Su and Han Jin, who were talking, immediately fell silent. Feng Ling also raised his head and looked in their direction. With a paw sound, the silver lighter in Li Nanhing's hand flashed slightly, and the man lit a cigarette without any change in his expression. What are you looking at? Go on. His voice was very light, but with an absolute tone of command, and he threw another word to the 2 people outside. Even though it was so far away that they could only see his lips, they could see that Boss Li's indifferent and cold words were, "Get lost." Han Jin and Xiao Su immediately walked away quickly, but from time to time, they looked back at Feng Ling, who was undergoing intensive training. Didn't he sacrifice himself to disguise as a woman to help Boss carry out the mission yesterday? Did something go wrong in the middle? He was fine before, but as soon as he came back, he was targeted by our cold-faced boss. Alas, why do I suddenly feel that Feng Ling is the most miserable person in our base? He is so pitiful, Xiao Su said in a low voice after walking away. Han Jin chuckled. How is he miserable? Every time Feng Ling receives a mission bonus, he doesn't get it himself, does he? He is stopped by boss. And the vacation he should get after the mission is over. Boss didn't give him, and even forced him to participate in the devil training. This is simply extortion. Yesterday Feng Ling risked his life. Chapter 853. Xiao Su also knew these things, but he still felt that Boss Li seemed to be a bit too cruel. To Feng Ling, Xiao Su didn't know what Feng Ling looked like after putting on the women's clothes yesterday. Because Feng Ling drove out after changing her clothes yesterday. Was it because Boss was stimulated by Feng Ling wearing women's clothes? Xiao Su looked back at the training ground that was getting farther and farther away. From a distance, he saw Boss Li throw the cigarette, but under his feet and stamp it out. Even if Boss didn't look in this direction from this angle, he felt that his gaze was a bit breathless. TSK Feng Ling, why did you suddenly make Boss angry? You were still Boss's little baby not long ago. It was from afternoon to 8 o'clock at night. When it was dinner time, Li Nanheng didn't ask her to stop training. Li Nanheng didn't go to eat, but just stood aside. In the past few hours, more than a dozen cigarette butts had been piled under his feet. Seeing that Feng Ling's physical strength had reached the extreme, she insisted on remaining silent, and would rather resign herself to the adversity than explain, or even say a word more. His eyes became more and more gloomy and terrifying. At 9 o'clock, the people in the base had gone back to rest, and only the two of them were here. Li Nanheng's voice made her heart tremble. You sweat so much. Are you tired? Feng Ling's hands were firmly on the ground. This was the second time she had tried to balance her limbs in the past few hours. She was motionless, but sweat slowly dripped down her cheeks, nose, neck, and slowly fell to the ground, leaving a trace of sweat on the ground, and then was blown away by the wind a few seconds later. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and insisted, I'm not tired. She was still very stubborn. Li Nanheng looked at her coldly, and suddenly chuckled. He then walked up to her, and reached out to pull her up from the ground. Feng Ling was already exhausted. When she was pulled up like this, she almost bumped into the man's arms. She raised her eyes and met the man's cold, dark eyes. She heard the man say coldly, 11 base has always eliminated those who are good at lying. This punishment is already light. Don't just sweat. Think about what you did wrong. Feng Ling's legs were weak, and she struggled to stand up. Her collar was still held in the man's hand. She took a breath and said hoarsely, Lie? Is boss dissatisfied with one of my missions? Or is he dissatisfied with one of my tests? I don't need to say that I'm loyal to the base. All my actions can prove my sincerity. Yet boss, you're using the title of a liar on my head? Li Nanheng sneered. So, do you think you are an honest person? Feng Ling looked at him. The back of her collar was tugged tightly. She was struggling to breathe, but she did not speak. Seeing that she was unwilling to speak, Li Nanheng suddenly let go of her collar. Caught off guard, she suddenly staggered and fell to the ground. Her knees also fell hard on the ground. But at the moment when the pain came, she gritted her teeth and did not make a sound. She supported herself with her hands on the ground, looked at the sweat dripping from her nose to the ground, closed her eyes, and took a few deep breaths. Stand up. Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket and looked down at her. His voice was extremely cold. Act like a man. Stand up. The man said the last 3 words very harshly. His harshness was filled with ruthlessness and anger that even he did not understand. He only coldly watched as she slowly staggered to her feet, and then stood in front of him weakly. Her face was already a little pale, but she still refused to admit defeat. She did not even want to beg, or tell the truth. Can you continue? He asked. Feng Ling looked up at him, and raised her hand to wipe her sweat. Yes. Then do it. With that, Li Nanheng threw her to the ground. The 3 cold words made Feng Ling's eyes tremble. She felt that Boss Li should have guessed it. Perhaps he just needed the last confirmation. Seeing that the man's back had gone far away, she slowly bent down, and continued to maintain the balance of her limbs. She did not stop because of the man's departure. The story she made up in front of him last night was not completely false. Although she was not stripped naked by a homeless man on the street, when she was 8 years old, she was targeted by several people who wanted to stop her, and drag her back to their room. She escaped several times. Later, someone told her to cut her hair short, think of herself as a man, and smear all kinds of dirty black gasoline on her face. Only in this way could she keep herself safe in that group of outlaws. Otherwise, a little girl like her, who was brought out of a wolf's den without parents and no one to rely on, would be swallowed alive by those perverts at any time. Then she did as she was told. Only by being a man could she have the most basic sense of security. After another 2 hours, 11 base had fallen into the silence of the night. When Li Nanheng walked back to the training ground, he saw that Feng Ling, who had been persisting in the intensive training, suddenly lay on the ground because of exhaustion. At the moment she lay down, she might want to rest for a while, but after hesitating for a few seconds, she continued to support her arms and insisted on doing it. He walked in. Hearing the footsteps, Feng Ling's face was dripping with sweat. She raised her head and looked at the man not far away. It was as though she was so stubborn that she didn't trust anyone except herself. It was as though she only wanted to stick to herself. It was as though she wouldn't beg for mercy no matter how painful it was. This made Li Nanheng so angry that even his arm, which had just been changed, was faintly aching. He walked over and looked at the boy who insisted on supporting herself with her hands on the ground. Can you still hold on? Feng Ling did not hesitate. Yes. Seeing that her hands and arms on the ground were trembling, Li Nanheng didn't say more, but just stood by and watched how long she could hold on. However, Feng Ling lay down several times, stubbornly continued to support herself, lay down, and support herself again. After repeating this for a long time, her clothes had been soaked with sweat, and the ground under her was also covered with sweat. At 12 o'clock in the evening, Li Nanheng looked at the time and said, "It's 12 o'clock." Feng Ling didn't say anything. He looked at her coldly. "You practice, and I'll go to sleep?" Feng Ling said, "Okay." Chapter 854. Li Nanheng left, leaving her to practice alone. But even if he said he was going back to sleep, only he knew if he could fall asleep. The next morning, the sky was already bright. Xiao Fei had just arrived near the training ground when he suddenly heard Tam, Lin Peng, and Kay hurriedly talking about something inside. He vaguely heard Feng Ling's name and abruptly walked in. However, as soon as they entered, they saw Feng Ling lying on the ground soaked. She was not conscious and was helped up by Kay and the others. She leaned her head on Kay's shoulder and only opened her eyes after Kay called her a few times. Seeing this scene, Xiao Fei's heart skipped a beat. He quickly walked over, pushed Tam and Lin Peng away, and leaned over to support Feng Ling. He raised his hand and pressed hard on the spot under her nose for a while until Feng Ling frowned and opened her eyes a little. He raised his hand and patted her face. "Feng Ling? Can you hear me? How are you?" "I'm fine." Her voice was hoarse, but she forced herself to push them away. However, Xiao Fei pressed down hard on her shoulder. "Go to the infirmary?" "No need." "Why don't you go to the infirmary? Do you think you are made of iron?" Kay was also anxious. "Hurry up, let's send you there first." Feng Ling was about to shake her head when suddenly, a familiar gaze came over. She looked up and saw Boss Li standing at the door of the training ground. Xiao Fei held Feng Ling and subconsciously turned his eyes. At this moment, Kay and the others felt that their boss was almost frozen to death. Especially after Feng Ling was held by Xiao Fei. Seeing the culprit who made Feng Ling like this, Xiao Fei didn't care that he was the boss, and was about to carry Feng Ling up with a cold face. Kay and the others took a step back in confusion. They didn't know what was going on, but they felt that Boss Li's eyes were completely cold. "Deputy Drillmaster Qiao, I can walk by myself." Feng Ling didn't look at Li Nanheng, but still pushed Xiao Fei's arm away. In the base, they had only trained for one night. Besides, they were both men. It was really inappropriate for her to be carried like this. "Are you sure you can leave like this?" Xiao Fei's eyes were clearly displeased. "You're still trying to show off at a time like this?" "It's fine, I'm used to it. I've suffered a lot in the past few years, in order to expand my body. I'll be fine after a good night's sleep." Xiao Fei still wanted to say something, but Feng Ling had already pulled her arm out of his hand. She turned around and staggered to the door with some difficulty. When she came up to Li Nanheng, she looked up at him. Boss, if you watched the surveillance footage of the training ground last night, you should know that I haven't stopped training in the past few hours. I haven't been slacking off. I've passed the physical test again. Li Nanheng stood there, his fingers paused hard. He wanted to take a deep breath, but found that there were too many people here. He couldn't even take a deep breath, so he just said stiffly, "Since you're so good, it's almost time for morning training. Why don't you do morning training with the sniper team?" Boss. Kay was startled to hear that. Boss, if you keep training like this, she will die. Feng Ling just went out for a mission the day before yesterday, and hasn't slept for 2 consecutive nights. Xiao Fei suddenly said angrily, and his tone was also extremely dissatisfied. Do you want her to die on the training ground? Li Nanheng looked at Feng Ling, who was still calm, but standing in front of him with a pale face. After a while, he said in a voice that only she could hear, "Let me ask you again, Feng Ling, do you think you are an honest person?" Feng Ling didn't raise her eyes. She just looked at the man's black collar and said calmly, "I am." Li Nanheng looked at her sweaty cheeks and messy hair, suddenly smiled, and still said in a voice that only she could hear, "Very good." Feng Ling clearly heard his smile, but she felt a chill on her back. She raised her eyes to look at him, only to hear the man's indifferent voice. "Go back to sleep. Don't let me see you again in 2 days." Kay had already approached. Although Li Nanheng's voice was low, Kay still heard it. He immediately went up to support Feng Ling and said, "Come on, thank boss. Boss allows you to rest for 2 days. Sleep well for 2 days, and don't come out to train these 2 days." Feng Ling's mouth was very dry, and her throat was very dry. She paused, looked up at Li Nanheng, and wanted to say thank you. But Li Nanheng directly glanced over her face and walked away coldly, not even listening to her thank you. After Li Nanheng's figure walked away from the training ground, Feng Ling's body softened, and Kay hurriedly supported her. "Feng Ling? How are you?" Feng Ling shook her head. "I'm fine. I'll go back by myself. You guys go for morning training first." "Nonsense," Xiao Fei said with a dark face. "Kay, send her back first. I'll go talk to boss." "There's no need to talk." Feng Ling turned to look at Xiao Fei. "It's my problem. There's no need to talk about it." Xiao Fei frowned, walked over and looked down at her. "What the hell is going on?" Feng Ling said indifferently. "Anyway, it's my problem. There's no need to talk about it. Don't go to boss because of me. Didn't he give me 2 days off? I'll be fine after 2 days of sleep." "That's right. I think it's obviously not the time to provoke boss. Brother Qiao, you'd better not interfere." Tam also said. Xiao Fei frowned and waved his hand impatiently, motioning for Kay to send Feng Ling back quickly. Kay nodded and hurriedly helped Feng Ling out of the sniper team's training ground. When they returned to the residence, Feng Ling felt that she was all sweaty and refused to sit on the bed, so Kay had to help her sit down on the chair by the window. Seeing that her hands and feet were so weak that they seemed to be disabled, he frowned and said, "I'll go to the infirmary to get some medicine for you after morning training." "No, he told me to rest for 2 days. How can I really sleep here for 2 days? I'll sleep for a while first. If I feel uncomfortable in the afternoon, I'll go to the infirmary to get some medicine," Feng Ling said and pushed him again. "Hurry up and go to training. Don't delay it because of me." "But you, I'm sitting here. What else can I do?" Feng Ling urged again. "Hurry up." Kay had to stand up. Last night was really the longest night for Feng Ling. But fortunately it was already dawn. She turned to look at the sky outside the window, and suddenly caught a glimpse of a red car parked in the parking lot of the base in the distance. Remembering what she heard in the canteen yesterday, she asked subconsciously, "Whose car is that?" Dash. Chapter 855. Kay only took a look outside and said disapprovingly, "It's Dr. Wen's sister's car." Feng Ling picked up the glass that Kay filled for her, withdrew her clear eyes, and didn't continue to look outside. "You really don't need me to accompany you to the infirmary?" "No, you can go to train." Seeing that Feng Ling was sweating all over, Kay guessed that she needed to take a shower. She had a quirk for so many years. She didn't like to be in her room before and after taking a shower, and Kay didn't doubt it. Anyway, there were many people with quirks in this world. Okay, call me if you need anything. I'll ask Brother Chow to allow me to take my phone with me during training today. Okay. The door was opened and closed, and Kay had gone far outside the door. When there was no one in the room, Feng Ling finally let out a long and slow breath, revealing her fatigue and discomfort. She tried to stand up with some difficulty, but frowned because of her sore back, especially the pain and numbness in her arms. Finally, she stood up, drank a few mouthfuls of water, and walked slowly and heavily into the bathroom. Every day in the base, she trained and sweated repeatedly, so taking a shower was as essential as eating 3 meals a day. But this time, Feng Ling took a long shower. Usually, she stood in the bathroom to take a shower, but now she really had no strength. She took a stool, put it in the bathroom, sat there to take a shower, and didn't want to go out after taking a shower, letting the moderately warm water pour on her head and body. She didn't know how long she took a shower. Maybe after feeling a little dizzy, she got up and walked out. She didn't eat anything last night or in the morning. After taking such a long hot shower, she didn't faint in it. Her physical strength and physique were excellent enough. After drying her body, she picked up the white breast wrapping cloth with some difficulty and wrapped it around her body. She looked at herself in the mirror, from the round cleavage in front of her chest to her flat appearance cruelly wrapped by the breast wrapping cloth. Her fingers hesitated for a long time before finally stuffing the last piece of the breast wrapping cloth into the secret button. Then, she picked up the loose t-shirt she usually wore and put it on. After sweating for a day and a night, he took a shower and felt as if he had been reborn from death. He felt clean and refreshed. Even though she hadn't eaten for more than 10 hours, Feng Ling didn't feel hungry at all. She lay on the bed, picked up her phone, and looked at the time. This time, she didn't feel insomnia at all. She closed her eyes and fell asleep. She slept until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when she was woken up by the sound of her phone vibrating. She turned over, picked up the phone beside her pillow, and put it to her ear. In a hoarse and sleepy voice she said, "Hello. Feng Ling, how is it? Have you eaten? Have you been to the infirmary?" It took her a long time to realize that the person on the phone was talking to her. She opened her eyes and glanced at the caller ID on the phone. Then she put the phone to her ear and said in a hoarse voice, "Deputy Drill Master Chow, I'm fine. What time is it now? I should have slept for a long time. I feel much better now. It's past 3 in the afternoon. Oh, then I've been sleeping since this morning." After hearing the time, Feng Ling sat up on the bed, raised her hand to rub her slightly messy short hair, and turned to look at the evening sky outside. Has today's training ended? Is there still sniper rifle training for me to go over? Wait for me. I'll be right there. No, there's no sniper rifle training today. You can rest. Okay. Feng Ling seemed to be in a daze. She rubbed her hair again, sat there with her eyes closed and held the phone. Half awake, she didn't seem to hear what the person on the other side of the phone said. She was so sleepy that she could barely cope with it. Okay. After saying yes, she heard the other party hang up the phone. Then she fell down again, covered herself with the quilt, and continued to sleep. This time, after sleeping for about half an hour, there was suddenly a knock on the door. Feng Ling abruptly opened her eyes. She thought that she had fallen asleep until the next morning. She stared out the window in confusion, and only returned to her senses after more than 10 seconds. She turned to look at the door that she had only knocked on a few times, but had stopped. She lifted the blanket and walked over. When she opened the door, she saw that Xiao Fei was holding an insulated lunchbox and a plate of sliced fruits. At the same time, he was also carrying a bottle of milk that she didn't know where. When the door was opened, Xiao Fei inexplicably felt that Feng Ling was a little cute, and even her hair was a little messy. He raised his eyebrows at her. "What are you waiting for? I've brought you food. Get out of the way. I'll come in." Feng Ling still nodded in confusion and took a step back. After Xiao Fei entered the door, he put the food on the table beside her bed, and then signaled her to come over to eat. Seeing that Feng Ling was still standing there, he said with a smile, "Haven't you woken up yet? Come and eat. Feng Ling finally understood. Ah, Deputy Drill Master Qiao. Did you say on the phone that you would bring me food? Qiao Fei suddenly looked at her, as if looking at a patient with severe amnesia. What do you think? Were you too sleepy just now, so you didn't hear it clearly? Feng Ling immediately smiled a little embarrassedly. She really didn't hear it clearly. If she had known that he said he would bring her food, she would definitely have refused. After all, this floor was the area where Bosley lived. If Qiao Fei came up like this and treated her so well, Bosley would probably vent his anger on him again. But since it was already here, there was no need to say anything more. She walked over to the table, but before she could sit down, Qiao Fei opened the glass bottle of milk and handed it to her. You probably haven't eaten anything since last night, so your stomach isn't feeling well. Drink this first to warm up your stomach before eating. Okay, thank you, Deputy Drill Master Qiao. Feng Ling took it, nodded to him, and sat down on the other side of the table. Qiao Fei glanced at her again. Feng Ling, who had just woken up, was not as cold and distant as she usually was. Instead, she looked adorable and sleepy. She was lazy and adorable, and it was rare for him to get close to her. He helped her open the lunchbox with a smile, opened the fruit plate covered with a layer of safety film, and handed her a small fork and a small spoon. Eat it. Chapter 856. Seeing Feng Ling being so obedient, Qiao Fei really wanted to pick up the chopsticks and feed her. But it wasn't that he didn't know what Feng Ling's personality was like. He guessed that this dazed look would only last for a moment. He looked at her with a smile. Eat first. You'll have the strength to talk when you're full. Feng Ling took a look at him again, asked while stuffing food into her mouth. What do you want to talk about? Qiao Fei glanced at the door that had closed automatically, and then looked at her. What's the matter between you and Bosley? According to what he said yesterday, does he know your secret? Feng Ling paused with the small fork in her hand. I'm not sure. What do you mean you're not sure? If he knows, he knows. If he doesn't know, he doesn't know. When I found out, the evidence was conclusive. How could I not know? Feng Ling didn't explain, but lowered her head and continued to eat. Seeing that she didn't want to talk about it, she had always been this kind of person. She would never tell others too much about herself, but she had an inexplicable attraction. Regardless of whether it was a man or a woman, they would always want to get closer to her for some reason. Qiao Fei simply sat next to her, raised his hand, and held Feng Ling's wrist. When Feng Ling subconsciously tried to pull her hand out, he held her tightly. Don't move. What? Feng Ling had been awake for a long time. Although she was not as cold and sharp as usual, she still instinctively wanted to pull her hand out when it was suddenly held like this. You've always regarded yourself as a man since you were a child, and you never had the concept of men and women in your mind, right? Qiao Fei held her hand, looked into her eyes, and asked seriously. Feng Ling looked at him for a while, neither nodding nor shaking her head. It wasn't that she didn't have the concept of men and women, but she never felt that there was any need to make a clear distinction between a man and a woman. So even if I like you, you can't feel it? Feng Ling looked surprised, but the next moment, she suddenly withdrew her hand. Qiao Fei's gaze faltered as he looked at the emptiness in his palm. He then looked at her again. Feng Ling put down the fork in her hand. Deputy Drill Master Qiao I. K and the other three often call him Brother Qiao. Among the five of them, only you call him Deputy Drill Master all day long. Qiao Fei looked at her. I know that you can't accept it for the time being, and I don't have any other intentions. I just want to tell you that you don't have to avoid my kindness to you too much. This is just a man's simple love and admiration for a girl. I don't have any ulterior motives. I just like you and want to take care of you. Feng Ling raised her hand and casually tugged at her hair. I've been used to being alone since I was a child, and I don't need anyone to take care of me. Thank you, Deputy Drill Master Qiao, for your kindness, but it's not that I can't accept it, but the things between men and women have never been in the scope of my consideration, nor in the scope of my endogenous plan. Qiao Fei immediately laughed and raised his eyebrows at her. Do you think you will stay in 11 base for the rest of your life? Sooner or later, you will go out and get married, won't you? Just like now. I am still in 11 base because I was too weak when I was a child. My parents hoped that I could be stronger and stronger, so they sent me here to train. But after a few years, I will still have to go back home. Whether it is to inherit the family business, or to get married and have children, men and women have to do their own things step by step. It's not a matter of whether you think about it or not. For example, I have never considered what kind of woman I will fall in love with, but suddenly I fall in love with you. Who can predict this? Feng Ling didn't know what to say. She just took another sip of milk, thought for a while, and said, "Is there any training program that I must participate in tomorrow? If not, I will rest for another day. If there is, I will go there earlier. Don't delay everyone's training. I'm talking to you about serious things. Don't change the subject with me." Xiao Fei frowned and looked at her seriously. "I'm also talking about serious things." Feng Ling put down the glass. "In this 11 base, shouldn't training, tasks, and rules be the most serious things?" Xiao Fei stared at her face for a while and suddenly smiled. "Are you reminding me that I have violated the rules and regulations of the base?" Feng Ling smiled lightly. "There is indeed a rule in the rules and regulations of the base, that no one is allowed to fall in love before leaving the base. After all, many missions involve life and death. Every member of the base can't leave too many worries and regrets for themselves. Otherwise, they will only be distracted. It's safest to be undistracted." Xiao Fei chuckled. "Silly girl, I didn't say that I want to fall in love. How old are you? You are only 17 years old. You will be an adult in another year. No matter how much I want to eat young grass, I won't be in a hurry." Feng Ling. "Besides, I can't leave the base until 3 years later. For the time being, I just like you. I'll take care of you as long as I can in the base. After I leave the base, no rules and regulations can control me. I can like any woman I want. I just want you to wait for me, understand?" Feng Ling. Deputy Drill Master Qiao. "Although I don't quite understand, the condition for the relationship between a man and a woman should be that both parties like each other, right?" Xiao Fei's eyelids twitched. Before he spoke, Feng Ling continued, "But I don't have this kind of feeling for you, Xiao Fei." Feng Ling looked straight at him and said a little embarrassedly, "Am I too straightforward?" Xiao Fei raised his hand to touch his forehead, and then raised his other hand as if to pat her shoulder. But then he hesitated and took it back. He patted his thigh and gritted his teeth to say, "It's okay. It's good to be straightforward. You have been a man for a long time. It's better to be straightforward than to be shy. I'm not in a hurry. Let's take it slow." Speaking up to this point, he put down his hand and looked at her with a smile. He said warmly, "Take it slow. I have patience. In the following years in the base, you'll definitely find the feeling one day. There's no need to take it slow. I don't." "All right, let's not talk about this topic for now." Xiao Fei raised his hand to signal her to shut up, not wanting to listen to her next words. "Eat first." Feng Ling still wanted to speak, but at this moment, Xiao Fei picked up his cell phone and glanced at it. "I just received a call before I came here. I have something to do in the base's conference room. You eat first. I'm not in a hurry to let you accept me now. I'm not in a hurry to reject you. I know you are a man now, and I will always treat you as a man, okay? But, all right, don't say any more. I'm leaving." Xiao Fei gave her another look to tell her to shut up, then turned to leave with his cell phone. Chapter 857. Feng Ling rested in the base for 2 days, and didn't see Li Nanheng for 2 days. Boss Li said that he didn't want to see her for 2 days, but she didn't lock herself in the residence for so long. She went to the canteen and the infirmary and saw Dr. Wen's sister. But Li Nanheng was the only one she didn't see. When she saw the red car, she subconsciously thought that Dr. Wen's sister should be a young and flamboyant girl like Qin Shuk. It turned out that she was a 24-year-old woman with fair skin, quiet, very smart and calm, who had graduated from a medical university in France. It was said that she had been working in the largest hospital in Los Angeles. It was rare for her to take a few days off, so she came to the base to see her brother. because her brother was not feeling well recently and went out to see a doctor. She took his place in the infirmary for a few days. It was because Feng Ling went to the infirmary to get medicine in the past 2 days that she had contact with this Miss Wen twice and felt that she was a very good woman. But last time in the canteen, when the base members mentioned Dr. Wen's sister, they seemed to be gossiping. What was going on? Would such a beautiful, gentle, and generous female doctor also have gossip? On the second night of Feng Ling's rest, there was a mission to be carried out in the base as usual. Although it was a small mission, it was said that Boss Li also went. The reason why everyone mentioned Boss Li also went was that he went with an injury. The injury on his arm a few days ago had not healed. This mission lasted for a total of 3 hours. Several terrorists who made trouble in Los Angeles were subdued by the members of 11 Base, and 2 were killed on the spot. It was said that the person who fired the shots was Li Nanheng. Feng Ling heard this from Kay. After all, she hadn't seen Boss for 2 days, and even the light in the next room hadn't been turned on in these 2 days. The group of people took the helicopter of 11 Base and rushed back to the base. Feng Ling looked at the helicopter over the base from the balcony. When the helicopter landed, she held the railing of the balcony and had an inexplicable impulse in her heart. Boss Li's arm was injured because of her. But from the moment he was injured to now, she had never cared about him. Now he went out with an injury. Even if it was only a skin wound, it was still a flesh wound. Any random movement would pull the wound, and it would definitely not heal well. As soon as Li Nanheng left the cabin, he rushed back to his residence to change. The moment he walked downstairs, he suddenly raised his head and looked at Feng Ling on the balcony for a moment. She was wearing the short-sleeved t-shirt that she usually only wore when she was sleeping. Her hair was clean, and she looked very obedient. It could be seen that she had rested well for the past 2 days. Her complexion was very good, and her condition was very good. However, her eyes were a little blank, and no one knew what she was thinking. He looked at her for a moment and didn't say anything. He gave up on the idea of returning to his residence and turned to leave. Seeing that he had left, Feng Ling abruptly returned to her senses. She quickly turned and ran out. She ran down the stairs and hurriedly ran behind him. Because she ran too fast, her breathing was slightly hurried. After a few seconds, she returned to normal. She straightened her body and looked at the tall man in front of her. His eyes were cold. "Boss." Li Nanheng looked at her and asked hoarsely, "Who allowed you to run out of the base dressed like this?" It was a reprimanding tone. It was indifferent. It was as if he hadn't experienced any life-or-death crisis in the 3 hours of the emergency support mission outside. However, his dark eyes showed that he was not in a good mood. Feng Ling tugged at the hem of her white t-shirt. "Boss, I just want to see the wound on your arm. If it hasn't healed, it has nothing to do with you. Go back." At this time, Feng Ling's eyes had already turned to his arm. Although he was wearing a combat uniform, she vaguely felt that his arm posture was not very relaxed. It should still be in pain, or the wound that had not healed well had split open again. She was about to speak when Han Jin came over and asked, "Boss, are you all right? I heard from Fatai that it was very dangerous outside just now. Those people kidnapped a lot of people there. When you rushed in to save them, you were more or less injured." Li Nanheng answered mildly, "I'm fine." Han Jin looked at him again. "You're not injured?" His arm movements are not flexible. He used too much force when he was rescuing the hostages. I think his wrist ligaments are strained. I'll go to the infirmary later. It's nothing serious. Ligament strain is not a trivial matter. Hurry up and go have a look. Don't leave any problems. The conversation ended. Li Nanheng left without saying another word to Feng Ling. Han Jin also took a look at Feng Ling and reminded her, "Isn't there a system in the base? You're not allowed to dress too casually outside of your residence. Why did you come out wearing this?" "I'll go back and change right away." Was the injury on Boss's arm very serious? Was that why his arm was stiff? "Shall I follow you to the infirmary?" Feng Ling asked. "No, Boss can go there by himself. Miss Wen is more careful than Dr. Wen. She is more reliable in changing the dressing for Boss. You don't have to worry at all." Everything seemed to have returned to peace. Feng Ling looked at the direction in which Li Nanheng and Han Jin left. After watching for a while, she thought about it and felt that it was necessary for her to go over and take a look. After all, these injuries were caused by her. He returned to his residence and put on his jacket and pants. After he was dressed neatly, he rushed to the infirmary. The infirmary. Li Nanheng sat in a chair and put his arm on the table. The woman in a white dress put on a white coat and bent down to carefully examine his wrist and arm. After a while, the woman concluded, "Wrist ligament strain. I'll apply medicine to you first. You can't use too much force in half a month. You have to rest well, or it will easily leave sequelae, which will be very bad for you to hold a gun in the future. Remember my words, in half a month. Don't use too much force." Li Nanheng frowned. "Half a month is impossible." The woman glared at him. "If you want your hand to be crippled and can't even hold a gun in the future, you can do whatever you want. Can't I do it in a week? How can I bargain with you?" The woman looked incredulous. "Don't you know how badly the wound on your arm was at that time? You hid it from others and the bullet directly grazed your flesh. If it was a little deeper, you would have seen the bone. You shouldn't have gone on the mission today. Now you still don't listen to the doctor's words." Li Nanheng was silent for a moment and compromised. "All right, I won't use too much force for the time being, but in some cases, I'll think about it later. Your temper is really irresistible. You've been like this since you were a child." Chapter 858. He remembered this woman's voice. She was Dr. Wen's sister. "Don't move. I'm applying medicine for you." The voice inside continued. "Do you have to be so meticulous? Nonsense. First you are injured like this, and then your ligaments are strained. If you don't pay attention, your arm will be useless." Li Nanheng looked at the woman who was carefully applying medicine for him, sat there expressionlessly, and let her apply medicine. He looked indifferent and didn't say anything more. "Forget it. You must control the strength of this arm in the short term. If you sprain or strain it again, you must come to me as soon as possible." Li Nanheng snorted. "I know. I'm not a child. You don't have to remind me like this. You were easier to talk to when you were a child. The older you get, the more difficult it is to talk to you," the woman said as she applied medicine on his arm, and then straightened up. In the past few hours, Li Nanheng had indeed overexerted his physical strength. In addition, he hadn't had a good rest these days. It was rare for him to sit here quietly and rest for a while, but he heard the woman nagging beside him. He closed his eyes and didn't speak anymore. While resting, he let her take the gauze and bandage it again. "Didn't the Li family ask you to go back? Why do you still insist on staying in 11 base?" After the female doctor bandaged his wound, she used her hand to gently massage his wrist to help him soothe his strained ligaments. Li Nanheng closed his eyes and didn't answer until he suddenly felt a tingling pain on his wrist. He opened his eyes and saw that the woman deliberately increased her strength. Obviously, she was abusing him. He immediately withdrew his hand and said lightly, "Xiaoqing, when will your brother come back? He has been away from the base for too long this time." Wen Leching raised her eyebrows and looked at him, and then at his arm, and smiled lightly. "What? Why are you so anxious to let my brother come back? If he doesn't come back, I will be the base doctor here. Isn't it the same? After all, you are a woman, and the members of the base are all men. It is not convenient for you to live here alone." "Why not? You are here, aren't you? This infirmary is my brother's territory. Who dares to do anything to me?" Wen Leching said as she reached out to grab his arm. "Don't hide. I am massaging you. No need." Li Nanheng avoided her hand and sat in place. His expression remained calm. "Isn't the medicine ready? Give me the medicine. I'll change it myself starting tomorrow." Wen Leching's hand, which was about to reach out, paused. She looked at him, withdrew her hand, and stood by the table. "You don't have to be so polite to me." Wen Leching and Li Nanheng were the same age. Although the Wen family was not as powerful as the Li family, they had known each other since they were very young, and had known each other for many years. Plus Dr. Wen's relationship with Li Nanheng in the base Wen Lecheng often had dealings with Li Nanheng because of her brother, whether she was still a student or had graduated. On the surface, Wen Lecheng called him by his name or Mr. Li, but in private, she called him Nanheng. Later, she called him Little Li Li and Little Heng Heng. Although Li Nanheng never talked to her, she was still used to calling him like this. Anyway, he would not be angry with her. As time went by, the members of the base heard rumors that there should be something between Boss Li and Dr. Wen's sister. Even if Boss Li was indifferent every day, Dr. Wen's sister obviously had feelings for Boss Li. Otherwise, why would she come here so often? Besides, she had now graduated from the medical school and was definitely an unreachable doctor in the largest hospital in Los Angeles. However, she liked to come to 11 Base when she was on vacation and would rather be a base doctor who bandaged some wounds every day. Fortunately, there was a rule in the base that the family members of the base were allowed to visit each year. Otherwise, Miss Wen might really plan to live here. Feng Ling stood outside the door for a while. The door of the infirmary was not closed very tightly. When she turned her head to approach, she could see the two people inside through the gap in the door. She saw Miss Wen forcibly pull up Li Nanheng's arm and massage his wrist with her hand. The doctor in the white dress was clean and beautiful. She had light makeup on her face and a thin layer of lipstick. As she massaged Li Nanheng's face, she said, "You should learn from my brother. He graduated from a medical university like me. But in order to enjoy life, he doesn't like to see so many people in the hospital and would rather stay in this 11 base. In fact, I think the salary here is higher than in the hospital, and it's so relaxing every day. How nice it is. In fact, I don't think it's necessary to force yourself so hard in life. If you like to live a comfortable life, you can live slowly and comfortably. As long as you are happy and relaxed, you don't have to make yourself like a tight spring. How tiring is that? And I heard from my brother that most of the other members of the base come here to see him because of the high intensity of training, muscle strain, or heat stroke. Only you, who seems to be fine, are the first to rush forward in any dangerous mission. You are injured here and there, and when your injury is healed, you continue to be injured. Do you really not see yourself as a human being? Do you think you are made of iron?" It was very late now. When Li Nanheng came back from a mission, it was already midnight, and now it was past midnight. Late at night, the base was silent. The young base general and the young female doctor shared the same room. No matter how you looked at it, they seemed to be a good match. Feng Ling changed her clothes in a hurry, and her short hair was a bit messy and stuck to her forehead and ears. She was neither a man nor a woman, and compared to the beautiful female doctor inside, it was like the difference between clouds and mud. Xiao Su said that Boss Li liked her. In this way, how could he like her? Perhaps it was just gossip in private. Nowadays, men would always be misunderstood because of some ambiguous situations between men. Xiao Su must have misunderstood. Feng Ling stood outside the door and saw the man who was usually as cold as ice sitting on the chair by the table tiredly with his eyes closed. From his expression, she could see that he was a bit relaxed. He was completely relieved to leave himself to this beautiful doctor, letting her hand apply medicine oil on his wrist from time to time and keep massaging it, and so on. From the tone of this Miss Wen, they should be very familiar with each other. And this very familiar relationship had been maintained for many years. Chapter 859. When Lecheng seemed to hear something, suddenly turned her eyes, and saw the figure standing outside the door. She looked up and asked in surprise, "You are?" The next second, he noticed the black uniform on the man's back and couldn't help but laugh. "Since you are a member of the base, just come in and talk. You don't have to be afraid to come in because your boss is here. He is just a patient here, and I treat him equally." After speaking, when Lecheng glanced at Feng Ling, "Ah, who are you? Feng Ling, right? I remember you." How could Wen Lecheng not remember the thinnest and smallest person in the base, who was as beautiful as a woman? Hearing her words, the man who was about to fall asleep on the chair suddenly opened his eyes and looked toward the door. Feng Ling subconsciously took a step back. Li Nanheng said indifferently, "Since you are here, why are you standing outside?" Feng Ling raised her hand awkwardly and touched her slightly messy hair. Since she had been discovered, there was nothing to hide, so she pushed the door open and walked in. The infirmary was air-conditioned and clean and tidy. There were several rooms in the room, all of which were places for medicine and medical equipment. When Lecheng continued to massage Li Nanheng's wrist and said to Feng Ling with a smile, "Take a seat first. I'll take a look at little Li's wrist after I treat it. What's wrong with you today? Are you still sore and uncomfortable like 2 days ago?" Little Li? Hearing this address in this tone, Feng Ling, who had just walked to their side, paused. She looked at Wen Lecheng and nodded. "Miss Wen, I'm fine. I just came to see boss's injury." Her eyes moved to Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng glanced at her coldly. "Why didn't you go back to rest, but came to the infirmary? Are you very free?" She stood in place, hesitated for a moment, and said, "I heard that you were seriously injured last time, and just now I heard that your wrist ligament was strained, so I came to have a look." Li Nanheng's expression was indifferent. "Now you see it?" Feng Ling looked at the area on his wrist that had just been wrapped with gauze. There was still some blood seeping out of the white gauze. It could be seen that it had not healed previously and had split open again during the mission today. There was a lot of blood, and it was still oozing out. She should have known it when Li Nanheng had shielded her from the bullets in the bar. But it had been urgent at that time, and she had been in a hurry to return to the base to change clothes. She hadn't had the chance to see what had happened after that. She hadn't expected it to be so serious. However, he didn't say anything. Even when Miss Wen criticized him for his injuries, he didn't explain anything. It was obvious that he didn't take this matter seriously. "If you're done, you can go." Li Nanheng withdrew his gaze and said in a cold tone. Wen Lecheng knew what kind of temper Li Nanheng had. Sometimes it was not too much to call him an iceberg, but no matter how he treated the members of the base, he didn't seem to be so cold and distant. She turned to look at Feng Ling, who was standing there not knowing whether to stay or leave. She suddenly let go of Li Nanheng's hand and went over to hold Feng Ling's hand. "Come here. Let me check your hand first." "No, Miss Wen, I'm much better. I just felt weak 2 days ago and was urged by the brothers in the team to come and have a look. Otherwise, I wouldn't have come to disturb you 2 days ago." Feng Ling was about to push her hand away, but when Lecheng secretly winked at Feng Ling, meaning that Li Nanheng needed to be quiet now and Feng Ling should cooperate with him, lest she annoyed their boss again. Feng Ling paused, and when Lecheng took the opportunity to pull her to sit down at the table, Li Nanheng closed his eyes again and lay back in the chair. When Lecheng touched Feng Ling's hand and said with a strange look, "It's really strange. You are a man, but your hand is whiter than mine and a little smaller than mine." As she spoke, she turned Feng Ling's hand over as if studying a strange treasure. Seeing the thin calluses on Feng Ling's palm, she said with a distressed look, "Such a beautiful hand, but there are some thin calluses on your palm. Fortunately, they are not too thick. If you take good care of them for a long time, they will disappear soon." With that, when Lecheng took out a hand cream from the drawer beside her desk, "Take it back and apply it for a few days. Let's see if the thin calluses on your palms will slowly soften. Such beautiful hands. I feel uncomfortable looking at the slightest blemish." Feng Ling put the hand cream back on the table and said seriously, "Thank you, Miss Wen, but I don't need these. Besides, I am a man. It doesn't matter if my hand is beautiful or not." "You're right." Wen Lecheng smiled. "But you're a man, but you're so good looking. I'm really curious about how beautiful your parents are. I've never seen a boy more beautiful than a girl like you. And I've never seen anyone more beautiful than you on TV." It was not the first time that she was praised by a woman. Last time it was Qin Shuk, and this time, it was Wen Lecheng. Feng Ling smiled faintly. In fact, she had nothing to say, but in the eyes of others she seemed to be shy. Seeing that Feng Ling was so shy, Wen Lecheng didn't say anything more. She just smiled, took her hand to check it for her, and then picked up the stethoscope. As soon as Feng Ling saw the stethoscope, she stood up. "I really don't need to check it. Since Boss Li's arm is fine, I'll go back first. It's getting late. Good night." With that, she was about to leave, when Lecheng looked at her in surprise. "Feng Ling, what's wrong with you? Last time when you came to the infirmary for a checkup, I wanted to use the stethoscope, but you avoided me and refused to be touched. Now you are avoiding me again. Although I am a woman, I am a doctor. I just lifted your clothes and pressed it against your body to listen to your stethoscope. Why did you? Feng Ling. Feng Ling has a strange habit. He doesn't like to be touched. Don't worry about him. As long as he doesn't die soon, just let him be. Li Nanhing's voice came from the other side. The man was still leaning against the back of the chair, with his back to them. The air around him was cold, and his voice was cold. Chapter 860. Her words made Feng Ling even more silent. She looked up at Wen Liqing. Dr. Wen's sister could really be described as generous, elegant, kind, and beautiful. But what she didn't understand was when she and Boss Li needed another person to explain for her, or even to ease the deadlock between her and Boss Li. She didn't like the current deadlock, but she really didn't know how to break it. The light in the infirmary poured down from above, and shone on Wen Liqing's spotless white dress. The two of them, one in black and the other in white, were completely different. Wen Liqing was wearing a fitted dress and an angelic doctor's white coat. Her long hair was neatly tied behind her head, and her eyebrows were curved. Her lips were full and beautiful, like a blooming flower in the sun. But what about her? Feng Ling's hand hanging on her waist moved and touched the hem of her uniform, that was not particularly neat, because she was in a hurry. Her closet was full of uniforms of the same size and color, and there were all kinds of white or black t-shirts that she would wear when sleeping. She was exactly the same as the other men in the base. Except for clothes, she only wore pants, which were loose and fat without a waist. Even her own hair was pitifully short. She wore no makeup. Her hair was messy. Feng Ling had never felt that there was anything wrong with being a man. But at this moment, standing in front of such a perfect woman, she really felt a little ashamed. Boss Li was obviously injured because of her. But he had to come to this female doctor to bandage his wound, and he could even be so relaxed in front of Miss Wen. Feng Ling wanted to say something. She wanted to say that Boss Li was actually really good. As long as Boss Li really cared about someone, how could he be as cold as ice? In fact, he also had a gentle side. None of them knew. When Li Nanheng dragged her out of the bathroom, pressed her against the wall, and bent down to kiss her, it seemed that he was forcefully pressing her, but in fact he covered her body tightly from head to toe, not allowing outsiders to overdo it. When Li Nanheng pulled her into his arms to protect her from the gunshot in the private room, how tight his hands were on her back. No one would know this kind of gentleness. In an instant, certain scenes surged through his mind. Those words lingered on her lips for a long time. But in the end, she just turned to Li Nanheng's back and said, "Boss, you must cooperate with the doctor to treat your injury. I'll go back first." She turned around and walked away quickly. Feng Ling hurriedly walked out of the infirmary, but she didn't know that after she left, when she ran around the building to the training ground, Li Nanheng's gaze swept to the window. Wen Liqing walked back and was about to pull his wrist again to continue massaging, but the man expressionlessly avoided her hand. When she was about to pull him again, he frowned, obviously impatient. Wen Liqing raised her eyebrows because of his sudden change of expression. "What are you doing? I haven't even cleaned off the medicinal oil on my hands." Li Nanheng sat there without saying a word, staring at the people who hurriedly left the training ground. The black uniform she was wearing today was not the zipper style, but the button style. One of the buttons at the front was crooked, causing the whole row of buttons to be out of place. However, the bottom of the uniform was indeed difficult to notice if one did not look carefully. Her hair was messy, and she was obviously in a hurry to come over when she was putting on her clothes. As she walked quickly, she raised her hand to comb her messy hair until her hair obediently stuck to her forehead, and then she continued to walk faster. Wen Liqing also looked out and saw that Feng Ling had gone far away. She immediately smiled and said, "I'm almost tired of looking at the group of men in your base. Only Feng Ling looks a little interesting." "What's interesting about him?" The man looked out of the window indifferently, his voice cold and indifferent. Wen Liqing smiled. When I first saw Feng Ling, I always suspected that he was a woman, but later I found out that he was not. But if he is really a girl, I think he will be very beautiful. It's a pity that he is so beautiful. How can he marry a wife in the future? He must be very picky. After all, it will be difficult for him to find a woman more beautiful than himself. Li Nanheng snorted coldly. How did you find out that he is not a woman? When Lecheng turned to look at him again, after a few seconds, she realized what he meant and said, "Of course not. 2 days ago, Xiao Fei came to help him get the medicine. Xiao Fei said that Feng Ling was so tired that he didn't even have the strength to lift his arms. It was he who forced him to apply the medicine to Feng Ling. This medicine should be applied to his limbs, chest and back. If Feng Ling was really a woman, how could Xiao Fei apply medicine to him like this?" Li Nanheng raised his eyes and slowly looked at Wen Liqing coldly. Xiao Fei. Yes, Xiao Fei's parents are also friends with our Wen family. I've always been very familiar with him. He always says what he says. He also said that Feng Ling's body is so thin that he doesn't look like he has been training in the base for a long time. No wonder Feng Ling doesn't dare to show others his body. He is really too thin to show others his body. He also said that Feng Ling may be born with this kind of physique. No matter how many years of training, he can't grow much muscle. As Wen Liqing spoke, she leaned over and whispered to Li Nanheng. Xiao Fei also said that he didn't expect that Feng Ling, as thin and small as Boss Li, could be on par with Feng Ling and could exchange at least a dozen rounds with him. His small body had great explosive power, which made him particularly curious about Feng Ling. Wen Liqing said again, "When I touched Feng Ling's hand just now, I really felt that it was so white and tender. A man is so beautiful and white that even women are jealous of him. Do you think God made him reincarnate into the wrong body?" Wen Liqing originally wanted to say something, but saw that Li Nanheng's eyes were looking out of the window and did not move for a long time. Feng Ling had clearly left. What was he still looking at? Wen Liqing didn't say more, and just thought that he was tired. She forcibly pulled his hand over and rubbed it. Then she picked up a small bottle of medicinal oil and poured it on his wrist, rubbing it back and forth. Li Nanheng looked out of the window at the dark night with a serious expression. In the dark of the night, he could not see that figure on the training ground. Was there something wrong with his senses? Or was that pair of silicone gel really so real? If it was really a man, there was no smile on Li Nanheng's handsome face, and he even wondered if he had accidentally turned gay. Thinking of Feng Ling's expression, as if she clearly wanted to say something but didn't speak, he only felt a sour feeling in his chest. Chapter 861. Monday. After training, Xiao Fei asked everyone to go back to change their clothes. Taking advantage of Fatty's birthday, the sniper team and Team 1 would have a dinner party tonight. She didn't expect that Fat Tai, who had always liked to go against Feng Ling and Team 1, would take the opportunity of his birthday to give them a rare holiday. They could enjoy a good day of eating to their heart's content. The members of both teams were overjoyed. They came down from the horizontal bars and quickly ran back to their residences. All of them tidied themselves up. The reason was that Dr. Wen's sister would be going to the dinner party today. It was rare for a woman to appear in the base, and it was said that Dr. Wen's sister had brought 2 female interns with her. With 3 women around, these single men who couldn't even find a female mosquito in the base were very excited. After changing clothes, Tam asked, "Hey, by the way, isn't Boss Li's arm injured? Is he still going?" Xiao Fei said, "I just called and asked. He said he won't go and told us to go and have fun by ourselves." Kay immediately cheered heartily by the side. After cheering, he didn't forget to put on an act. "Boss won't go? How can that be? Without him, we will have no backbone." Tam, "That's right. I can't even drink happily." Lin Cheng, "Without Boss Li's cold eyes, I may not be able to control myself." Ayaya, Lei Peng, "If Boss is not here, my body is very itchy. There is no one to manage me." Xiao Fei sneered and patted their heads. "Stop pretending. Are you unhappy that no one cares about you? That's right. At least there are 3 girls today. Although Miss Wen has an affair with our boss, There are still 2 other interns who haven't graduated yet, right? I heard that female students studying medicine are very hot-tempered. I happen to like this type of girl. If boss is here, it's not convenient for me to pick up girls. If he glares at me, I will immediately be afraid. Len Qing chuckled. That's right. Without boss, there is no one to control us. We are not afraid of being scolded. Without Bosley, no one told them to drink less. No one reminded them, what if they had a mission at night? There was also no one who said that alcohol was the most taboo during physical training, and strictly told everyone to drink at most 3 bottles. Boss wasn't here tonight, which meant that he could drink wine, eat meat, and flirt with women if he wanted. Feng Ling hesitated for a moment and secretly said to Qiao Fei, Deputy Drill Master Qiao, I won't go tonight. Qiao Fei took a look at her, and Kay immediately put his arm around Feng Ling's shoulder to say, Why don't you go? Are you going to stay in the base to accompany boss? Kay was just joking, but Qiao Fei looked at Feng Ling. Feng Ling said indifferently, I'm not used to this kind of lively occasion. Last time, when we welcomed boss back, I was already tortured by you guys. If you come up with any tricks this time, I definitely won't cooperate. Wouldn't it ruin our family's mood? Besides, I don't drink much, so I might as well stay in the base and sleep for 3 more hours. Come on. If you want to accompany boss, just say so. Anyway, boss said that he won't go tonight, so he definitely won't go. Kay put his arm around her shoulder. Feng Ling did not explain further, and only responded with an N. Qiao Fei. You really won't go? No. With that, Feng Ling turned to Kay, who was holding her. By the way, I have something to ask you. What is it? You just said that Miss Wen and Bosley have an affair. Kay immediately looked at her with an expression of, It's not easy, Feng Ling. You finally understand. What? Are you jealous? Feng Ling rolled her eyes at him. Don't make wild guesses. I haven't paid much attention to Dr. Wen and his sister in the past few years, so I'm not very clear about their situation in the base. Also, what's going on between boss and Miss Wen you just mentioned? Kay raised his eyebrows. What else can it be? It's just something between a man and a woman. It was because Feng Ling didn't understand the things between a man and a woman that she asked. This Kay. Now he was deliberately keeping her guessing. Seeing him doing this deliberately, Feng Ling simply stopped asking. You can go. I'm going back. Hey, why are you going? We haven't finished talking yet. Kay reached out and put his arm around her shoulder to pull her back, lowered his head, and whispered in her ear. You should have heard of the Li family's status in the Chinese community in the United States. So in the United States, as long as the family conditions are good and influential in the upper class, they usually have some contact with the Li family, including our Deputy Drill Master Qiao's family. I heard that Miss Wen and our boss Li went to the same kindergarten when they were very young and later grew up together. But our boss came to the base very early, so he and Miss Wen can only be regarded as childhood friends. They should have kept in touch occasionally over the years, and Miss Wen often comes to the base because of her brother, so she is very familiar with our boss. Kay took a look at Feng Ling, who was calm and emotionless. But something happened the year before you came to the base. At that time, I had just come to the base. The secret entrance behind 11 base was bombed by terrorists. Miss Wen happened to be in the base at that time, and was injured by the explosion. She was in a coma for several days, and boss stayed by her side for a few days until Miss Wen woke up. So the brothers in the base all think that there should be a deep relationship between boss and Miss Wen. But in fact, we didn't see anything between boss and Miss Wen with our own eyes. Boss is usually very cold to others, but he stayed by Miss Wen's side for several days, so it should be similar to what we guessed. But it has been almost 4 years. Time really flies. Not to mention me. Even you have been in the base for more than 3 years. Kay smiled and held her. You will be 18 in 10 months, right? At that time, our brothers in the base will do a good job for you. No, there are many people in their teens and 20s in this base. Who would have a big birthday party? There's no need to be so high profile. I'll go back first. Nonsense. Look at Fatai. When he heard that Dr. Wen was going to bring 2 interns over, He was so excited that he directly held a big birthday party on his birthday. Even that damn fatty can do it. How can our Feng Ling be worse than him? When the time comes, you don't have to pay for it. Brothers will do it for you. Feng Ling rolled her eyes at him. All right, you. Hurry up and go pick up your girls. You speak as if without Fatty's treat, you will have a chance to meet the interns brought by Miss Wen. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.